What is Coming by H.G. Wells, narrated by Sam Kusi. Chapter 1. Forecasting the Future. Prophecy may vary between being an intellectual amusement and a serious occupation, serious not only in its intentions but in its consequences, for it is the lot of prophets who frighten or disappoint to be stoned. But for some of us moderns who have been touched with the spirit of science, prophesying is almost a habit of mind. Science is very largely analysis aimed at forecasting. The test of any scientific law is our verification of its anticipations. The scientific training develops the idea that whatever is going to happen is really here now, if only one could see it. And when one is taken by surprise, the tendency is not to say with the untrained man, "Now who'd have thought it?" but, "Now what was it we overlooked?" Everything that has ever existed or that will ever exist is here for anyone who has eyes to see. But some of it demands eyes of superhuman penetration. Some of it is patent. We are almost as certain of next Christmas as the tides of the year 1960 and the death before 3000 AD of everybody now alive as if these things had already happened. Below that level of certainty, but still at a very high level of certainty, there are such things as men will probably be making aeroplanes of an improved pattern in 1950, or that there will be a through railway connection between Constantinople and Bombay, and between Baku and Bombay in the next half century. From such grades of certainty as this, one may come down the scale until the most obscure mystery of all is reached, the mystery of the individual. Will England presently produce a military genius? Or what will Mr. Belloc say the day after tomorrow? The most accessible field for the prophet is in the heavens. The least is the secret of the jumping cat within the human skull. How will so-and-so behave, and how will the nation take it? For such questions as that, we need the subtlest guesses of all. Yet, even to such questions as these, the sharp, observant man may risk an answer with something rather better than an even chance of being right. The present writer is a prophet by use and wont. He is more interested in tomorrow than he is in today, and the past is just material for future guessing. Think of the men who have walked here, said a tourist in the Roman Colosseum. It was a futurist mind that answered. Think of the men who will. It is surely as interesting that presently some founder of the world republic, some obstinate opponent of militarism or legalism, or the man who will first release atomic energy for human use, will walk along the Via Sacra as that Cicero or Giordano Bruno or Shelley have walked there in the past. To the prophetic mind, all history is and will continue to be a prelude. The prophetic type will steadfastly refuse to see the world as a museum. It will insist that here is a stage set for a drama that perpetually begins. Now, this forecasting disposition has led the writer not only to publish a book of deliberate prophesying called Anticipations, but almost without premeditation to scatter a number of more or less obvious prophecies through his other books. The first to last he has been writing for 20 years, so that it is possible to check a certain proportion of these anticipations by the things that have happened. Some of these shots have hit remarkably close to the bullseye of reality. There are a number of inners and outers, and some clean misses. Much that he wrote about in anticipation is now established commonplace. In 1894, there were still plenty of skeptics of the possibility either of automobiles or aeroplanes. It was not until 1898 that Mr. S. P. Langley of the Smithsonian Institute could send the writer a photograph of a heavier-than-air flying machine actually in the air. There were articles in the monthly magazines of those days proving that flying was impossible. One of the writer's luckiest shots was a description in Anticipations in 1900 of trench warfare and of a deadlock almost exactly upon the lines of the situation after the Battle of the Marne. And he was fortunate in the same work in his estimate of the limitations of submarines. He anticipated Sir Percy Scott by a year in his doubts of the decisive value of great battleships. See An Englishman Looks at the World, and he was sound in denying the decadence of France, in doubting before the Russo-Japanese struggle, the greatness of the power of Russia, which was still in those days a British bogey, in making Belgium the battleground in a coming struggle between the mid-European powers and the rest of Europe, and he believes in foretelling a renascent Poland. Long before Europe was familiar with the engaging personality of the German Crown Prince, he represented great airships sailing over England, which country had been too unenterprising to make any, under the command of a singularly anticipatory Prince Karl, and in The World Set Free, the last disturber of the peace is a certain Balkan fox. In saying, however, here and there that before such a year so-and-so will happen, or that so-and-so will not occur for the next 20 years, he was generally pretty widely wrong. Most of his time estimates are too short. He foretold, for example, a special motor track apart from the high road between London and Brighton before 1910, which is still a dream, but he doubted if effective military aviation or aerial fighting would be possible before 1950, which is a miss on the other side. He would draw a modest veil over certain still wider misses that the idle may find for themselves in this book. He prefers to count the hits and leave the reckoning of the misses to those who will find a pleasure in it. Of course, these prophecies of the writers were made upon a basis of very generalized knowledge. What can be done by a really sustained research into a particular question, especially if it is a question essentially mechanical, is shown by the work of a Frenchman all too neglected by the trumpet of fame, Clement Ader. Mr. Ader was probably the first man to get a mechanism up into the air for something more than a leap. His role testifies prolonged a jump as far as 50 meters as early as 1890. In 1897, his plane fairly flew. This is a year ahead of the date of my earliest photograph of S.P. Langley's aeroplane in midair. This, however, is beside our present mark. The fact of interest here is that in 1908, when flying was still almost incredible, Mr. Adair published his Military Aviation. Well, that was 8 years ago, and men have been fighting in the air now for a year, and there is still nothing being done that Mr. Adair did not see, and which we, if we had had the wisdom to attend to him, might not have been prepared for. There is much that he foretells which is still awaiting its inevitable fulfillment. So clearly can men of adequate knowledge and sound reasoning power see into the years ahead in all such matters of material development. But it is not with the development of mechanical inventions that the writer now proposes to treat. In this book, he intends to hazard certain forecasts about the trend of events in the next decade or so. Mechanical novelties will probably play a very small part in that coming history. This worldwide war means a general arrest of invention and enterprise, except in the direction of the war business. Ability is concentrated upon that. The types of ability that are not applicable to warfare are neglected. There is a vast destruction of capital and a waste of the savings that are needed to finance new experiments. Moreover, we are killing off many of our brightest young men. It is fairly safe to assume that there will be very little new furniture on the stage of the world for some considerable time, that if there is much difference in the roads and railways and shipping, it will be for the worse. That architecture, domestic equipment, and so on will be fortunate if in 1924 they stand where they did in the spring of 1914. In the trenches of France and Flanders, and on the battlefields of Russia, the Germans have been spending and making the world spend the comfort, the luxury, and the progress of the next quarter century. There is no accounting for taste, but the result is that while it is possible for the writer in 1900 to write anticipations of the reaction of the mechanical progress upon human life and thought, in 1916 his anticipations must belong to quite another system of consequences. The broad material facts before us are plain enough. It is the mental facts that have to be unraveled. It isn't now a question of what thing, what faculty, what added power will come to hand, and how will it affect our ways of living. It is a question of how are people going to take these obvious things, waste of the world's resources, arrest the material progress, the killings of a large moiety of the males in nearly every European country, and universal loss and unhappiness. We are going to deal with realities here at once more intimate and less accessible than the effects of mechanism. As a preliminary reconnaissance, as it were, over the religion of problems we have to attack, let us consider the difficulties of a single question, which is also a vital and central question in this forecast. We shall not attempt a full answer here because too many of the factors must remain unexamined. Later, perhaps, we may be in a better position to do so. This question is the probability of the establishment of a long world peace. At the outset of the war, there was a very widely felt hope among the intellectuals of the world that this war might clear up most of the outstanding international problems and prove the last war. The writer, looking across the gulf of experience that separates us from 1914, recalls two pamphlets whose very titles are eloquent of this feeling: The War That Will End War and The Peace of the World. Was the hope expressed in those phrases a dream? Is it already proven a dream? Or can we read between the lines of the war news, diplomatic disputations, threats and accusations, political wranglings and stories of hardship and cruelty that now fill our papers, anything that still justifies a hope that these bitter years of world sorrow are the darkness before the dawn of a better day for mankind? Let us handle this problem with a preliminary examination. What is really being examined here is the power of human reason to prevail over passion and certain other restraining and qualifying forces. There can be little doubt that if one could canvass all mankind and ask them whether they would rather have no war anymore, the overwhelming mass of them would elect for universal peace. If it were a war of the modern mechanical type that was in question, with air raids, high explosives, poison gas and submarines, there can be no doubt at all about the response. Give peace in our time, O Lord, is more than ever the common prayer of Christendom, and the very war makers claim to be peacemakers. The German Emperor has never faltered in his assertion that he encouraged Austria to send an impossible ultimatum to Serbia and invaded Belgium because Germany was being attacked. The Kramp Kaiser Empire, he assures us, is no eagle, but a double-headed lamb resisting the shearers and butchers. The apologists for war are in a hopeless minority. A certain number of German Prussians who think war good for the soul, and the dear ladies of the London Morning Post who think war so good for the manners of the working classes, are rare, discordant voices in the general chorus against war. If a mere unsupported and uncoordinated will for peace could realize itself, there would be peace, and an enduring peace, tomorrow. But as a matter of fact, there is no peace coming tomorrow and no clear prospect yet of an enduring, universal peace at the end of this war. Now, what are the obstructions and what are the antagonisms to the exploitation of this worldwide disgust with war and the worldwide desire for peace, so as to establish a world of peace? Let us take them in order, and it will speedily become apparent that we are dealing here with a subtle quantitative problem in psychology, a constant weighing of whether this force or that force is the stronger. We are dealing with influences so subtle that the accidents of some striking dramatic occurrence, for example, may turn them this way or that. We are dealing with the human will, and thereby comes a snare for the feet of the would-be impartial prophet. To foretell the future is to modify the future. It is hard for any prophet not to break into exhortation after the fashion of the prophets of Israel. The first difficulty in the way of establishing a world of peace is that it is nobody's business in particular. Nearly all of us want a world of peace in an amateurish sort of way, but there is no specific person or persons to whom one can look for the initiatives. The world is a supersaturated solution of the will for peace, and there is nothing for it to crystallize upon. There is no one in all the world who is responsible for the understanding and overcoming of the difficulties involved. There are many more people, and there is much more intelligence concentrated upon the manufacture of cigarettes or hairpins than those upon the establishment of a permanent world peace. There are a few special secretaries employed by philanthropic Americans, and that is about all. There has been no provision made even for the emoluments of these gentlemen when universal peace is attained. Presumably, they would lose their jobs. Nearly everybody wants peace. Nearly everybody would be glad to wave a white flag with a dove on it now, provided no unfair use was made of such a demonstration by the enemy. But there is practically nobody thinking about the arrangements needed, and nobody making nearly as much propaganda for the instruction of the world in the things needful as is made in selling any popular make of automobile. We have all our particular business to attend to, and things are not got by just wanting them. Things are got by getting them and rejecting whatever precludes our getting them. That is the first great difficulty. The formal peace movement is quite amateurish. It is so amateurish that the bulk of people do not even realize the very first implication of the peace of the world. It has not succeeded in bringing this home to them. If there is to be a permanent peace of the world, it is clear that there must be some permanent means of settling disputes between powers and nations that would otherwise be at war. That means that there must be some head power, some point of reference, a supreme court of some kind, a universally recognized executive over and above the separate governments of the world that exists today. That does not mean that those governments have to disappear, that nationality has to be given up, or anything so drastic as that. But it does mean that all those governments have to surrender almost as much of their sovereignty as the constituent sovereign states, which make up the United States of America, have surrendered to the federal government. If their unification is to be anything more than a formality, they will have to delegate a control of their interstate relations to an extent for which few minds are prepared at present. It is really quite idle to dream of a warless world in which states are still absolutely free to annoy one another with tariffs, with the blocking and squeezing of trade routes, and the ill treatment of immigrants and travelling strangers, and between which there is no means of settling boundary disputes. Moreover, as between the United States of the world and the United States of America, there is further complication of the world position that almost all the great states of Europe are in possession, firstly, of highly developed territories of alien language and race, such as Egypt, and secondly, of barbaric and less developed territories, such as Nigeria or Madagascar. There will be nothing stable about a world settlement that does not destroy in these possessions the national preference of the countries that own them, and that does not prepare for the immediate or eventual accession of these subject peoples to state rank. Most certainly, however, thousands of intelligent people in those great European countries who believe themselves ardent for a world peace will be staggered at any proposal to place any part of our empire under a world administration on the footing of a United States territory. Until they cease to be staggered by anything of the sort, their aspirations for a permanent peace will remain disconnected from the main current of their lives, and that current will flow sluggishly or rapidly towards war. For essentially, these possessions are like tariffs, like the strategic occupation of neutral countries of secret treaties. They are forms of the conflict between nations to oust and prevail over other nations. Going on with such things and yet deprecating war is really not an attempt to abolish conflict. It is an attempt to retain conflict and limit its intensity. It is like trying to play hockey on the understanding that the ball shall never travel faster than 8 miles an hour. Now, it not only stands in our way to a permanent peace of the world that the great mass of men are not prepared for, even the most obvious implications of such an idea, but there is also a second invincible difficulty that there is nowhere in the world anybody, any type of man, any organization, any idea, any nucleus or germ that could possibly develop into the necessary over-government. We are asking for something out of the air, out of nothingness, that will necessarily array against itself the resistance of all those who are in control or interested in the control of the affairs of sovereign states of the world as they are at present, the resistance of a gigantic network of government organizations, interests, privileges, assumptions. Against this, a headless, vague aspiration, however universal, is likely to prove quite ineffective. Of course, it is possible to suggest that the Hague Tribunal is conceivably the germ of such an overriding direction and supreme court as the peace of the world demands. But in reality, the Hague Tribunal is a mere legal automatic machine. It does nothing unless you set it in motion. It has no initiative. It does not even protest against the most obvious outrages upon the phantom of a world conscience, international law. Pacifists, in their search for some definitive starting point about which the immense predisposition for peace may crystallize, have suggested the Pope and various religious organizations as a possible basis for the organization of peace. But there would be no appeal from such a beginning to the non-Christian majority of mankind, and the suggestion in itself indicates a profound ignorance of the nature of the Christian churches. With the exception of the Quakers and a few Russian sects, no Christian sect or church has ever repudiated war. Most have gone out of the way to sanction it and bless it. It is altogether too rashly assumed by people whose sentimentality outruns their knowledge that Christianity is essentially an attempt to carry out the personal teachings of Christ. It is nothing of the sort, and no church authority will support that idea. Christianity, more particularly after the ascendancy of the Trinitarian doctrine was established, was, and is, a theological religion. It is the religion that triumphed over Arianism, Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and the like. It is not based on Christ, but on its creeds. Christ indeed is not even its symbol. On the contrary, the chosen symbol of Christianity is the cross. It was very largely a religion of the legions. It was the warrior, Theodosius, who, more than any single other man, imposed it upon Europe. There is no reason, therefore, either in precedent or profession, for expecting any plain lead from the churches in this tremendous task of organizing and making effective the widespread desire of the world for peace. And even were this the case, it is doubtful if we should finding the divines and dignitaries of the Vatican, of the Russian and British official churches, or of any other of the multitudinous Christian sects, the power and energy, the knowledge and ability, or even the goodwill needed to negotiate so vast a thing as the creation of a world authority. One other possible starting point has been suggested. It is no great feat for a naive imagination to suppose the President of the Swiss Confederation or the President of the United States for each of these two systems is an exemplary and encouraging instance of the possibility of the pacific synthesis of independent states, taking a propagandist course and proposing extensions of their own systems to the suffering belligerents. But nothing of the sort occurs. And when you come to look into the circumstances of these two presidents, you will discover that neither of them is any more free than anybody else to embark upon the task of creating a state overriding, war-preventing organization of the world. He has been created by a system, and he is bound to a system. His concern is with the interests of the people of Switzerland or of the United States of America. President Wilson, for example, is quite sufficiently occupied by the affairs of the White House, by the clash of political parties, by the interferences with American overseas trade, and the security of American citizens. He has no more time to give the projects for the fundamental reconstruction of international relationships than has any recruit drilling in England, or any captain on an ocean liner, or any engineer in charge of a going engine. We are all, indeed, busy with the things that come to hand every day. We are all anxious for a permanent world peace, but we are all up to the neck in things that leave us no time to attend to this world peace that nearly every sane man desires. Meanwhile, a small minority of people who trade upon contention, militarists, ambitious kings and statesmen, war contractors, loan mongers, sensational journalists, follow up their interests and start and sustain war. There lies the paradoxical reality of this question. Our first inquiry lands us into the elucidation of this deadlock. Nearly everybody desires a world peace, and yet there is not apparent anywhere any man free and able and willing to establish it, while on the other hand, there are a considerable number of men in positions of especial influence and power who will certainly resist the arrangements that are essential to its establishment. But does this exhaust the question, and must we conclude that mankind is doomed to a perpetual, futile struggling of states and nations and peoples, breaking ever and again into war? The answer to that would probably be yes, if it were not for the progress of war. War is continually becoming more scientific, more destructive, more coldly logical, more intolerant of non-combatants, and more exhausting of any kind of property. There is every reason to believe that it will continue to intensify these characteristics. By doing so, it may presently bring about a state of affairs that will supply just the lacking elements that are needed for the development of a world peace. I would venture to suggest that the present war is doing so now, that it is producing changes in men's minds that may presently give us both the needed energy and the needed organization from which a world direction may develop. The first, most distinctive thing about this conflict is the exceptionally searching way in which it attacks human happiness. No war has ever destroyed happiness so widely. It has not only killed and wounded an unprecedented proportion of the male population of all the combatant nations, but it has also destroyed wealth beyond precedent. It has also destroyed freedom of movement, of speech, of economic enterprise. Hardly anyone alive has escaped the worry of it and the threat of it. It has left scarcely a life untouched and made scarcely a life happier. There is a limit to the principle that everybody's business is nobody's business. The establishment of a world state which was interesting only to a few cranks and visionaries before the war is now the lively interest of a very great number of people. They inquire about it. They have become accessible to ideas about it. Peace organization seems, indeed, to be following the lines of public sanitation. Everybody in England, for example, was bored by the discussion of sanitation until the great cholera epidemic. Everybody thought public health a very desirable thing, but nobody thought it intensely and overridingly desirable. Then the interest in sanitation grew lively, and people exerted themselves to create responsible organizations. Crimes of violence again were neglected in the great cities of Europe until the danger grew to dimensions that evolved the police. There come occasions when the normal concentration of an individual upon his own immediate concerns becomes impossible, as for instance, when a man who is stock-taking in his business premises discovers that the house next door is on fire. A great many people who have never troubled their heads about anything but their own purely personal and selfish interests are now realizing that quite a multitude of houses about them are ablaze and that the fire is spreading. That is one change the war will bring about that will make for world peace a quickened general interest in its possibility. Another is the certainty that the war will increase the number of devoted and fanatic characters available for disinterested effort. Whatever other outcome this war may have, it means that there lies ahead a period of extreme economic and political dislocation. The credit system has been strained and will be strained and will need unprecedented readjustments. In the past, such phases of uncertainty, sudden impoverishment and disorder as certainly lie ahead of us have meant for a considerable number of minds a release, or if you prefer it, a flight from the habitual and selfish. Types of intense religiosity, of devotion and of endeavor are let loose, and there will be much more likelihood that we may presently find what is impossible to find now, a number of devoted men and women ready to give their whole lives with a quasi-religious enthusiasm to this great task of peace establishment, finding in such impersonal work a refuge from the disappointments, limitations, losses and sorrows of their personal life, a refuge we need but little in more settled and more prosperous periods. They will be but the outstanding individuals in a very universal quickening, and simultaneously with this quickening of the general imagination by experience, there are certain other developments in progress that point very clearly to a change under the pressure of this war of just those institutions of nationality, kingship, diplomacy, and interstate competition that have hitherto stood most effectually in the way of a world pacification. The considerations that seem to point to this third change are very convincing to my mind. The real operating cause that is, I believe, going to break down the deadlock that has hitherto made the Supreme Court and the federal government for the world at large a dream lies in just that possibility of an inconclusive peace, which so many people seem to dread. Germany, I believe, is going to be beaten, but not completely crushed by this war. She is going to be left militarist and united with Austria and Hungary, and unchanged in her essential nature. And out of that state of affairs comes, I believe, the hope for an ultimate confederation of the nations of the earth. Because in the face of a league of the Central European powers attempting recuperation, cherishing revenge, dreaming of a renewal of the struggle, it becomes impossible for the British, the French, the Belgians, Russians, Italians or Japanese to think any longer of settling their differences by war among themselves. To do so will mean the creation of opportunity for the complete reinstatement of German militarism. it will open the door for a conclusive German hegemony. Now, however clumsy and confused the diplomacy of these present allies may be, challenged constantly as it is by democracy and hampered by a free, venal, and irresponsible press in at least 3 of their countries, the necessity they will be under will be so urgent and so evident that it is impossible to imagine that they will not set up some permanent organ for the direction and coordination of their joint international relationships. It may be a queerly constituted body at first. It may be of a merely diplomatic pretension. It may be called a Congress or any old name of that sort, but essentially, its business would be to conduct a joint fiscal, military, and naval policy, to keep the peace of the Balkans and Asia, to establish a relationship with China, and organize joint and several arbitration arrangements with America. And it must develop something more sure and swift than our present diplomacy. One of its chief concerns will be the right of way through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, and the watching of the forces that stir up conflict in the Balkans and the Levant. It must have unity enough for that. It must be much more than a merely leisurely, unauthoritative conference of representatives. For precisely similar reasons, it seems to me incredible that the 2 great Central European powers should ever fall into sustained conflict again with one another. They too will be forced to create some overriding body to prevent so suicidal a possibility. America too, it may be, will develop some Pan-American equivalent. Probably the 100 millions of Latin America may achieve a method of unity and then deal on equal terms with the present United States. The thing has been ably advocated already in South America. Whatever appearances of separate sovereignties are kept up after the war, the practical outcome of the struggle is quite likely to be this: that there will be only 3 great world powers left: the anti-German allies, the allied Central Europeans, the Pan-Americans. And it is to be noted that, whatever the constituents of these 3 powers may be, none of them is likely to be a monarchy. They may include monarchies, as England includes dukedoms, but they will be overriding alliances, not overriding rulers. I leave it to the mathematician to work out exactly how much the chances of conflict are diminished when there are practically only 3 powers in the world instead of some scores. And these new powers will be in certain respects unlike any existing European states. None of the 3 powers will be small or homogeneous enough to serve dynastic ambitions, embody a national or racial culture, or fall into the grip of any group of financial enterprises. They will be more comprehensive, less romantic, and more businesslike altogether. They will be, to use a phrase suggested a year or so ago, great states, and the war threat between the 3 will be so plain and definite, the issues will be so lifted out of the spheres of merely personal ambition and national feeling, that I do not see why the negotiating means, the standing conference of the 3, should not ultimately become the needed nucleus of the world state for which at present we search the world in vain. There are more ways than one to the world state, and this second possibility of post-war conference and a conference of the Allies growing almost unawares into a Pacific organization of the world, since it goes on directly from existing institutions, since it has none of the quality of a clean break with the past which the idea of an immediate world state and Pax Mundi involves, and more particularly since it neither abolishes nor has in it anything to shock fundamentally the princes, the diplomatists, the lawyers, the statesmen, and the politicians, the nationalists and suspicious people, since it gives them years in which to change and die out and reappear in new forms, and since at the same time it will command the support of every intelligent human being who gets his mind clear enough from his circumstances to understand its import, is a far more credible hope than the hope of anything coming de novo out of Hague foundations or the manifest logic of the war. But of course, there weighs against these hopes the possibility that the Allied powers are too various in their nature, too biased, too feeble intellectually and imaginatively to hold together and maintain any institution for cooperation. The British press may be too silly not to foster irritation and suspicion. We may get Carsonism on a larger scale, trading on the resuscitation of dying hatreds. The British and Russian diplomatists may play annoying tricks upon one another by sheer force of habit. There may be many troubles of that sort. Even then, I do not see that the hope of an ultimate world peace vanishes, but it will be a Roman world peace made in Germany, and there will have to be several more great wars before it is established. Germany is too homogeneous yet to have begun the lesson of compromise and the renunciation of the dream of national conquest. The Germans are a national, not an imperial people. France has learnt that through suffering, and Britain and Russia because, for 2 centuries, they have been imperial and not national systems. The German conception of world peace is as yet a conception of German ascendancy. The Allied conception becomes, perforce, one of mutual toleration. But I will not press this inquiry farther now. It is, as I said at the beginning, a preliminary exploration of one of the great questions with which I propose to play in these articles. The possibility I have sketched is the one that most commends itself to me as probable. After a more detailed examination of the big operating forces at present working in the world, we may be in a position to revise these suggestions with a greater confidence and draw our net of probabilities a little tighter. Chapter 2: The End of the War. The prophet who emerges with the most honor from this war is Bloch. It must be 15 or 16 years ago since this gifted Pole made his forecast of the future. Perhaps it is more, for the French translation of his book was certainly in existence before the Boer War. His case was that war between antagonists of fairly equal equipment must end in a deadlock because of the continually increasing defensive efficiency of entrenched infantry. This would give the defensive an advantage over the most brilliant strategy and over considerably superior numbers that would completely discourage all aggression. He concluded that war was played out. Footnote 1. This chapter was originally a newspaper article. It was written in December 1915 and published about the middle of January. Some of it has passed from the quality of anticipation to achievement, but I do not see that it needs any material revision on that account. His book was very carefully studied in Germany. As a humble disciple of Bloch, I should have realized this, but I did not, and that failure led me into some unfortunate prophesying at the outbreak of the war. I judged Germany by the Kaiser, and by the Kaiser worship which I saw in Berlin. I thought that he was a theatrical person who would dream of vast massed attacks and tremendous cavalry charges, and that he would lead Germany to be smashed against the Allied defensive in the West, and to be smashed so thoroughly that the war would be over. I did not properly appreciate the more studious and more thorough Germany that was to fight behind the Kaiser and thrust him aside. The Germany we British fight now, the Oswald Krupp Germany of 1915. That Germany, one may now perceive, had read or thought over and thought out the Bloch problem. There was also a translation of Bloch into French. In English, a portion of his book was translated for the general reader and published with a preface by the late Mr. W. T. Stead. It does not seem to have reached the British military authorities, nor was it published in England with an instructive intention. As an imaginative work, it would have been considered worthless and impracticable. But it is manifest now that if the Belgian and French frontiers had been properly prepared, as they should have been prepared when the Germans built their strategic railways with trenches and gun emplacements and secondary and tertiary lines, the Germans would never have got 50 miles into either France or Belgium. They would have been held at Liège and in the Ardennes. 500,000 men would have held them indefinitely. But the Allies had never worked trench warfare. They were unready for it. Germans knew of their unreadiness, and their unreadiness, it is quite clear, they calculated. They did not reckon, it is now clear, that they were right in not reckoning the Allies as contemporary soldiers. They were going to fight a 1900 army with a 1914 army, and their whole opening scheme was based on the conviction that the Allies would not entrench. Somebody in those marvelous maxims from the Dark Ages that seem to form the chief reading of our military experts said that the army that entrenches is a defeated army. The silly dictum was repeated and repeated in the English papers after the Battle of the Marne. It shows just where our military science had reached in 1914, namely to a level a year before Bloch wrote. So the Allies retreated. For long weeks, the Allies retreated out of the west of Belgium, out of the north of France, and for rather over a month, there was a loose mobile war as if Bloch had never existed. The Germans were not fighting the 1914 pattern of war. They were fighting the 1899 pattern of war, in which direct attack, outflanking, and so on were still supposed to be possible. They were fighting confident in their overwhelming numbers, in their prepared surprise, in the unthought-out methods of their opponents. In the Victorian War that ended in the middle of September 1914, they delivered their blow. They overreached. They were successfully counterattacked on the Marne, and then abruptly, almost unfairly, it seemed to the British sportsmanlike conceptions, they shifted to the game played according to the very latest rules of 1914. The war did not come up to date until the Battle of the Aisne. With that, the second act of the great drama began. I do not believe that the Germans ever thought it would come up to date so soon. I believe they thought that they would hustle the French out of Paris, come right up to the Channel of Calais before the end of 1914, and then entrench, produce the submarine attack and the Zeppelins against England, working from Calais as a base, and that they would end the war before the spring of 1915, with the Allies still a good 15 years behindhand. I believe the Battle of the Marne was the decisive battle of the war, in that it shattered this plan, and that the rest of the 1914 fighting was Germany's attempt to reconstruct their broken scheme in the face of an enemy who was continually getting more and more nearly up to date with the fighting. By December, the Bloc, who had seemed utterly discredited in August, was justified up to the hilt. The world was entrenched at his feet. By May, the lagging military science of the British had so far overtaken events as to realize that shrapnel was no longer so important as high explosive, and within a year, the significance of machine guns, a significance thoroughly ventilated by imaginative writers 15 years before, was being grasped by the conservative but by no means inadaptable leaders of Britain. The war, since that first attempt, admirably planned and altogether justifiable from a military point of view, of Germany to rush a victory, has consisted almost entirely of failures on both sides either to get round or through or over the situation foretold by Bloch. There has been only one marked success, the German success in Poland due to the failure of the Russian munitions. Then, for a time, the war in the East was mobile and precarious while the Russians retreated to their present positions and the Germans pursued and tried to surround them. That was a lapse into the pre-block style. Now the Russians are again entrenched, their supplies are restored. The Germans have a lengthened line of supplies, and Bloch is back upon his pedestal so far as the Eastern theatre goes. Bloch has been equally justified in the Anglo-French attempt to get round through Gallipoli. The forces of the India office have pushed their way through unprepared country towards Baghdad, and are now entrenching in Mesopotamia. But from the point of view of the main war, that is too remote to be considered either getting through or getting round, and so too the losses of the German colonies and the East African War are scarcely to be reckoned with in the main war. They have no determining value. There remains the Balkan Struggle, but the Balkan Struggle is something else. It is something new. It must be treated separately. It is a war of treacheries and brags and appearances. It is not a part of, it is a sequence to, the Deadlock War of 1915. But before dealing with this new development of the latter half of 1915, it is necessary to consider certain general aspects of the Deadlock War. It is manifest that the Germans hoped to secure an effective victory in this war before they ran up against Bloch. But reckoning with Bloch, as they certainly did, they hoped that even in the event of the war getting to earth, it would still be possible to produce novelties that would sufficiently neutralize Bloch to secure a victorious peace. With unexpectedly powerful artillery suddenly concentrated, with high explosives, with asphyxiating gas, with a well-organized system of grenade, throwing and mining, with attacks of flaming gas, and above all, with a vast munition-making plant to keep them going, they had a very reasonable chance of hacking their way through. Against these prepared novelties, the Allies have had to improvise, and on the whole, the improvisation has kept pace with the demands made upon it. They have brought their military science up to date, and today the disparity in science and equipment between the antagonists has greatly diminished. There has been no escaping Bloch after all, and the deadlock, if no sudden peace occurs, can end now in only one thing: the exhaustion in various degrees of all the combatants and the succumbing of the most exhausted. The idea of a conclusive end of the traditional pattern of this war, of a triumphal entry into London, Paris, Berlin, or Moscow, is to be dismissed altogether from our calculations. The end of this war will be a matter of negotiation between practically immobilized and extremely shattered antagonists. There is, of course, one aspect of the Bloch deadlock that the Germans at least have contemplated. If it is not possible to get through or round, it may still be possible to get over. There is the air path. This idea has certainly taken hold of the French mind, but France has been too busy and is temperamentally too economical to risk large expenditures from what is necessarily an experiment. The British are too conservative and skeptical to be the pioneers in any such enterprise. The Russians have been too poor in the necessary resources of mechanics and material. The Germans alone have made any sustained attempt to strike through the air at their enemies beyond the war zone. Their Zeppelin raids upon England have shown a steadily increasing efficiency, and it is highly probable that they will be repeated on a much larger scale before the war is over. Quite possibly, too, the Germans are developing an accessory force of large aeroplanes to cooperate in such an attack. The long coasts of Britain, the impossibility of their being fully equipped throughout their extent, except at a prohibitive cost of men and material, to resist their invaders, exposes the whole length of the island to considerable risk and annoyance from such an expedition. It is doubtful, though, if the utmost damage that an air raid is likely to inflict upon England would count materially to the exhaustion process, and the moral effect of these raids has been, and will be, to stiffen the British resolution to fight this war through the conclusive ending of any such possibilities. The net result of these air raids is an inflexible determination of the British people rather to die in death grips with German militarism than to live and let it survive. The best chance for the aircraft was at the beginning of the war, when a surprise development might have had astounding results. That chance has gone by. The Germans are racially inferior to both French and English in the air, and the probability of effective blows over the deadlock is on the whole a probability in favour of the Allies. Nor is there anything on or under the sea that seems likely now to produce decisive results. We return from these considerations to a strengthened acceptance of bloc. The essential question for the prophet remains, therefore, the question of which group of powers will exhaust itself most rapidly. And following on from that comes the question of how the successive stages of exhaustion will manifest themselves in the combatant nations. The problems of this war, as of all war, end as they begin in national psychology. It will be urged that this is reckoning without the Balkans. I submit that the German thrust through the wooded wilderness of Serbia is really no part of the war that has ended in the deadlock of 1915. It is dramatic, tragic, spectacular, but it is quite inconclusive. Here there is no way round or through to any vital centre of Germany's antagonists. It turns nothing. It opens no path to Paris, London, or Petrograd. It is a long, long way from the Danube to either Egypt or Mesopotamia, and there, bloc is waiting. I do not think the Germans have any intention of so generous an extension of their responsibilities. The Balkan complication is no solution of the deadlock problem. It is the opening of the sequel. A whole series of new problems are opened up directly as we turn to this most troubled region of the Balkans. Problems of the value of kingship, of nationality, of the destiny of such cities as Constantinople, which from their very beginning have never had any sort of nationality at all, of the destiny of countries such as Albania, where a tangle of intense tribal nationalities is distributed in spots and patches, or Dalmatia, where one extremely self-conscious nation and language is present in the towns and another in the surrounding country, or Asia Minor, where no definite national boundaries, no religious, linguistic, or social homogeneities have ever established themselves since the Roman legions beat them down. But all these questions can really be deferred or set aside in our present discussion, which is a discussion of the main war. Whatever surprises or changes this last phase of the Eastern Empire, that blood-clotted melodrama may involve, they will but assist and hasten on the essential conclusion of the Great War, that the Central Powers and their pledged antagonists are in a deadlock, unable to reach a decision, and steadily, day by day, hour by hour, losing men, destroying material, spending credit, approaching something unprecedented, unknown, that we try to express to ourselves by the word exhaustion. Just how the people who use the word exhaustion so freely are prepared to define it is a matter for speculation. The idea seems to be a phase in which the production of equipped forces ceases through the using up of men or material, or both. If the exhaustion is fairly mutual, it need not be decisive for a long time. It may mean simply an ebb of vigour on both sides, unusual hardship, a general social and economic disorganisation and grading down. The fact that a great killing off of men is implicit in the process, and that the survivors will be largely under discipline, militates against the idea that the end may come suddenly through a vigorous revolutionary outbreak. Exhaustion is likely to be a very long and a very thorough process, extending over years. A war of attrition may last into 1918 or 1919, and may bring us to conditions of strain and deprivation still only very vaguely imagined. What happens in the Turkish Empire or India or America or elsewhere may extend the areas of waste and accelerate or retard the process, but is quite unlikely to end it. Let us ask now, which of the combatants is likely to undergo exhaustion most rapidly, and what is of equal or greater importance, which is likely to feel it first and most? No doubt there is a bias in my mind, but it seems to me that the odds are on the whole heavily against the Central Powers. Their peculiar German virtue, their tremendously complete organization, which enabled them to put so large a proportion of their total resources into their first onslaught and to make so great and rapid a recovery in the spring of 1915, leaves them with less to draw upon now. Out of a smaller fortune, they have spent a larger sum. They are blockaded to a very considerable extent, and against them fight not merely the resources of the Allies, but, thanks to the complete British victory in the sea struggle, the purchasable resources of all the world. Conceivably, the Central Powers would draw upon the resources of their Balkan and Asiatic allies, but the extent to which they can do that may very easily be overestimated. There is a limit to the power for treason of these supposititious German monarchs that Western folly has permitted to possess these Balkan thrones, thrones which need never have been thrones at all, and none of the Balkan people is likely to witness with enthusiasm the complete looting of his country in the German interest by a German court. Germany will have to pay on the nail for most of her Balkan help. She will have to put more into the Balkans than she takes out. Compared with the world behind the Allies, the Turkish Empire is a country of mountains, desert, and undeveloped lands. To develop these regions into a source of supplies under the strains and shortages of wartime will be an immense and dangerous undertaking for Germany. She may open mines she may never work, build railways that others will enjoy, sow harvests for alien reaping. The people the Bulgarians want in Bulgaria are not Germans but Bulgarians. The people the Turks want in Anatolia are not Germans but Turks. And for all these tasks, Germany must send men. Men? At present, so far as any judgment is possible, Germany is feeling the pinch of the war much more even than France, which is habitually parsimonious and instinctively, cleverly economical, and Russia, which is hardy and insensitive. Great Britain has really only begun to feel the stress. She has probably suffered economically no more than have Holland or Switzerland, and Italy and Japan have certainly suffered less. All these three great countries are still full of men, of gear, of saleable futures. In every part of the globe, Great Britain has colossal investments. She has still to apply the great principle of conscription not only to her sons, but to the property of her overseas investors and of her landed proprietors. She has not even looked yet at the German financial expedients of a year ago. She moves reluctantly but surely towards such a thoroughness of mobilization. There need be no doubt that she will completely socialize herself, completely reorganize her whole social and economic structure sooner than lose this war. She will do it clumsily and ungracefully, with much internal bickering, with much trickery on the part of her lawyers, with much baseness on the part of her landlords, but she will do it not so slowly as a logical mind might anticipate. She will get there a little late, expensively, but still in time. The German group, I reckon, therefore, will become exhausted first. I think, too, that Germany will, as a nation, feel and be of what is happening to her sooner than any other of the nations that are sharing in this process of depletion. In 1914, the Germans were reaping the harvest of 40 years of economic development and business enterprise. Property and plenty were new experiences, and a generation had grown up in whose world a sense of expansion and progress was normal. There existed amongst it no tradition of the great hardship of war, such as the French possessed, to steel its mind. It had none of the irrational mute toughness of the Russians and British. It was a sentimental people, making a habit of success. It rushed chanting to war against the most grimly heroic and the most stolidly enduring of races. Germany came into this war more buoyantly and confidently than any other combatant. It expected another 1871. At the utmost, it anticipated a year of war. Never were a people so disillusioned as the Germans must already be. Never has a nation been called upon for so complete a mental readjustment. Neither conclusive victories nor defeats have been theirs, but only a slow, vast transition from joyful effort and an illusion of rapid triumph to hardship, loss and loss of substance, the dwindling of great hopes, the realization of ebb in the tide of national welfare. Now they must fight on against implacable, indomitable allies. They are under stresses now as harsh, at least, as the stresses of France, and compared with the French, the Germans are untempered steel. We know little of the psychology of this new Germany that has come into being since 1871, but it is doubtful if it will accept defeat, and still more doubtful how it can evade some ending to the war that would admit the failure of all its great hopes of Paris subjugated, London humbled, Russia suppliant, Belgium conquered, the Near East a prey. Such an admission will be a day of reckoning that German imperialism will postpone until the last hope of some breach among the Allies, some saving miracle in the old Eastern Empire, some dramatically snatched victory at the 11th hour is gone. Nor can the pledged Allies consent to a peace that does not involve the evacuation and compensation of Belgium and Serbia, and at least the autonomy of the lost Rhine provinces of France. That is their very minimum. That, and the making of Germany so sick and weary of military adventure that the danger of German ambition will cease to overshadow European life. Those are the ends of the main war. Europe will go down through stage after stage of impoverishment and exhaustion until these ends are attained or made forever impossible. But these things form only the main outline of a story with a vast amount of collateral interest. It is to these collateral issues that the amateur in prophecy must give his attention. It is here that the German will be induced by his government to see his compensations. He will be consoled for the restoration of Serbia by the prospect of future conflicts between Italian and Yugoslavia that will let him in again to the Adriatic. His attention will be directed to his newer, closer association with Bulgaria and Turkey. In those countries, he will be told he may yet repeat the miracle of Hungary, and there may also be another Hungary in Poland. It will be whispered to him that he has really conquered those countries, when indeed it is highly probable he has only spent his substance in setting up new assertive alien allies. The Kaiser, if he is not too afraid of the president of Sarajevo, may make a great entry into Constantinople, with an effect of conquering what is, after all, only a temporarily allied capital. The German will hope also to retain his fleet, and no peace, he will be reminded, can rob him of his hard-earned technical superiority in the air. The German air fleet of 1930 may yet be something as predominant as the British Navy of 1915, and capable of delivering a much more intimate blow. Had he not better wait for that? When such consolations as these become popular in German press, we of the pledged allies may begin to talk of peace, for these will be its necessary heralds. The concluding phase of a process of general exhaustion must almost inevitably be a game of bluff. Neither side will admit its extremity. Neither side, therefore, will make any direct proposals to its antagonists, nor any open advances to a neutral. But there will be much inspired peace talk through neutral media, and the consultations of the anti-German allies will become more intimate and detailed. Suggestions will leak out remarkably from both sides to journalists and neutral go-betweens. The Eastern and Western allies will probably begin quite soon to discuss an anti-German Zollverein and the coordination of their military and naval organizations in the days that are to follow the war. A discussion of a Central European Tolverein is already afoot. A general idea of the possible rearrangement of the European states after the war will grow up in the common European and American mind. Public men on either side will indicate concordance with this general idea, and some neutral power, Denmark or Spain or the United States or Holland, will invite representatives to an informal discussion of these possibilities. Probably, therefore, the peace negotiations will take an extraordinary form of two simultaneous conferences, one of the pledged allies sitting probably in London or Paris, and the other of representatives of all the combatants meeting in some neutral country. Holland would be the most convenient, while the war will still be going on. The Dutch conference would be in immediate contact by telephone and telegraph with the Allied conference and the Berlin. The broad conditions of a possible peace will begin to get started towards the end of 1916, and a certain lassitude will creep over the operations in the field. The process of exhaustion will probably have reached such a point by that time that it will be a primary fact in the consciousness of common citizens of every belligerent country. The common life of all Europe will have become miserable. Conclusive blows will have receded out of the imagination of the contending powers. The war will have reached its fourth and last stage as a war. The war of the great attack will have given place to the war of the military deadlock. The war of the deadlock will have gone on, and as the great combatants have become enfeebled relatively to the smaller states, there will have been a gradual shifting of the interest to the war of treasons and diplomacies in the Eastern Mediterranean. Quickly thereafter, the last phase will be developing into predominance, in which each group of nations will be most concerned no longer about victories or conquests, but about securing for itself the best chances of rapid economic recuperation and social reconstruction. The commercial treaties, the arrangements for future associated action made by the great allies among themselves, will appear more and more important to them, and the mere question of boundaries less and less. It will dawn upon Europe that she has already dissipated the resources that have enabled her to levy the tribute paid for her investment in every quarter of the earth, and that neither the Germans nor their antagonists will be able for many years to go on with these projects for world exploitation, which lay at the root of the Great War. Very jaded and anemic nations will sit about the table on which the new map of Europe will be drawn. Each of the diplomatists will come to that business with a certain preoccupation. Each will be thinking of his country as one thinks of a patient of doubtful patience and temper who is coming to out of the drugged stupor of a crucial, ill-conceived and unnecessary operation. Each will be thinking of labor, wounded and perplexed, retaining to the disorganized and nationalized factories from the capital has gone a-fighting, and to which it may never return. Chapter 3. Nations in Liquidation. The war has become a war of exhaustion. One hears a great deal of the idea that financial collapse may bring it to an end. A number of people seem to be convinced that a war cannot be waged without money, that soldiers must be paid, munitions must be bought, that for this money is necessary and the consent of bank depositors, so that if all the wealth of the world were nominally possessed by some one man in a little office, he could stop the war by saying simply, "I will lend you no more money." Now, as a matter of fact, money is a power only insofar as people believe in it and governments sustain it. If a state is sufficiently strong and well organized, its control over the money power is unlimited. If it can rule its people, and if it has the necessary resources of men and material within its borders, it can go on in a state of war so long as these things last, with almost any flimsy sort of substitute for money that it chooses to print. It can enroll and use the men and seize and work the material. It can take over the land and cultivate it and distribute its products. The little man in the office is only a power because the state chooses to recognize his claim. So long as he is convenient, he seems to be a power. So soon as the state is intelligent enough and strong enough, it can do without him. It can take what he wants and tell him to go and hang himself. That is the melancholy ultimate of the usurer. That is the quintessence of finance. All credit is state-made, and what the state has made, the state can alter or destroy. The owner of the creditor have never had any other power to give or withhold credit than the credit that was given to them. They exist by sufferance or superstition and not of necessity. It is the habit of overlooking this little flaw in the imperatives of ownership that enables people to say that this war cannot go beyond such and such a date. The end of 1916 is much in favour just now because we cannot pay for it. It would be about as reasonable to expect a battle to end because a landlord had ordered the soldiers off his estate. So long as there are men to fight and stuff to fight with, the war can go on. There is bankruptcy, but the bankruptcy of states is not like the bankruptcy of individuals. There is no such thing among states as an undischarged bankrupt who is forbidden to carry on. A state may keep on going bankrupt indefinitely and still carry on. It will be the next step in our prophetic exercise to examine the differences between state bankruptcy and the bankruptcy of a subject of the state. The belligerent powers are approaching a phase when they will no longer be paying anything like 20 shillings in the pound. In a very definite sense, they are not paying 20 shillings in the pound now. That is not going to stop the war, but it involves a string of consequences and possibilities of the utmost importance to our problem of what is coming when the war is over. The exhaustion that will bring this war to its end at last is a process of destruction of men and material. The process of bankruptcy that is also going on is nothing of the sort. Bankruptcy destroys no concrete thing. It merely writes off a debt. It destroys a financial but not an economic reality. It is in itself a mental, not a physical fact. A owes B a debt. He goes bankrupt and pays a dividend, a fraction of his debt, and gets his discharge. B's feelings, as we novelists used to say, are better imagined than described. He does his best to satisfy himself that A can pay no more, and then A and B both go about their business again. If A is a sufficiently poor man not to be formidable and has gone bankrupt on a small scale, he gets squeezed ferociously to extract the last farthing from him. He may find himself in jail and his home utterly smashed up. If he is a richer man and has failed on a larger scale, our law is more sympathetic, and he gets off much more easily. Often his creditors find it advisable to arrange with him so that he will still carry on with his bankrupt concern. They find it is better to allow him to carry on than to smash him up. There are countless men in the world living very comfortably indeed and running businesses that were once their own property for their creditors. There are still more who have written off princely debts and do not seem to be half a penny worth the worse. And their creditors have found a balm in time and philosophy. Bankruptcy is only painful and destructive to small people and helpless people, but then for them everything is painful and destructive. It can be a very light matter to big people. It may be almost painless to a state. If England went bankrupt in the completest way tomorrow and repudiated all its debts, both as a nation and as a community of individuals, if it declared, if I may use a self-contradictory phrase, a permanent moratorium, there would be not an acre of ploughed land in the country, not a yard of cloth or a loaf of bread, the less for that. There would be nothing material destroyed within the state. There would be no immediate convulsion. Use and want would carry most people on some days before they even began to doubt whether so-and-so could pay his way and whether there would be wages at the end of the week. But people who lived upon rent or investments or pensions would presently be very busy thinking how they were going to get food when the butcher and baker insisted upon cash. It would be only with comparative slowness that the bulk of men would realize that a fabric of confidence and confident assumptions had vanished, that checks and banknotes and token money and every sort of bond and scrip were worthless, that employers had nothing to pay with, shopkeepers no means of procuring stock, that metallic money was disappearing, and that a paralysis had come upon the community. Such an establishment as a workhouse or an old-fashioned monastery, living upon the produce of its own farming and supplying all its labour, would be least embarrassed amidst the general perplexity, for it would not be upon a credit basis, but a socialistic basis, a basis of direct reality, and its need for payments would be incidental, and land-owning peasants growing their own food would carry on, and small cultivating occupiers who could easily fall back on barter for anything needed. The mass of the population in such a country as England would, however, soon be standing about in hopeless perplexity and on the verge of frantic panic, although there was just as much food to be eaten, just as many houses to live in, and just as much work needing to be done. Suddenly the pots would be empty and famine would be in the land, although the farms and butchers' shops were still well stocked. The general community would be like an automobile when the magneto fails. Everything would be there and in order, except for the spark of credit which keeps the engine working. That is how quite a lot of people seem to imagine national bankruptcy, as a catastrophic jolt. It is a quite impossible nightmare of cessation. The reality is the completest contrast. All the belligerent countries of the world are, at the present moment, quietly, steadily, and progressively going bankrupt, and the mass of people are not even aware of this process of insolvency. An individual, when he goes bankrupt, is measured by the monetary standard of the country he is in. He pays 5 or 10 or 15 or so many shillings in the pound. A community in debt does something which is in effect the same, but in appearance rather different. It still pays a pound, but the purchasing power of the pound has diminished. This is what is happening all over the world today. There is a rise in prices. This is automatic national bankruptcy, unplanned, though perhaps not unforeseen. It is not a deliberate state act, but a consequence of the interruption of communications, the diversion of productive energy, the increased demand for many necessities of the government by the general waste under war conditions. At the beginning of this war, England had a certain national debt. It has paid off none of that original debt. It has added to it tremendously. So far as money and bankers' records go, it still owes and intends to pay that original debt. But if you translate the language of pounds into realities, you will find that in loaves or iron or copper or hours of toil, or indeed in any reality except gold, it owes now, so far as that original debt goes, far less than it did at the outset. As the war goes on and the rise in prices continues, the subsequent borrowings and contracts are undergoing a similar bankrupt reduction. The attempt of the landlord of small weekly and annual properties to adjust himself to the new conditions by raising rents is being checked by legislation in Great Britain and has been completely checked in France. The attempts of Labour to readjust wages have been partially successful, in spite of the eloquent protests of those great exponents of plain living, economy, abstinence, and honest, modest, underpaid toil, Mr. Asquith, McKenna, and Runciman. It is doubtful if the rise in wages is keeping pace with the rise in prices. So far as it fails to do so, the load is on the usual pack animal, the poor man. The rest of this loss falls chiefly upon the creditor class, the people with fixed incomes and fixed salaries, the landlords who have let at long leases, the people with pensions, endowed institutions, the church, insurance companies, and the like. They are all being scaled down. They are all more able to stand scaling down than the proletarians. assuming that it is possible to bring up wages to the level of higher prices and that the rise in rents can be checked by legislation or captured by taxation, the rise in prices is, on the whole, a thing to the advantage of the propertyless man as against accumulated property. It writes off the past and clears the way for a fresh start in the future. An age of cheapness is an old usurer's age. England before the war was a paradise of ancient usuries. Everywhere were great houses and enclosed parks, the multitude of gentlemen's servants and golf clubs, and such like excrescences of the comfort of prosperous people was perpetually increasing. It did not pay to build labourers' cottages, and the more expensive sort of automobile had driven the bicycle as a pleasure vehicle off the roads. Western Europe was running to fat and not to muscle as America is today. But if that old usurer's age is over, the young usurer's age may be coming. To meet such enormous demands as this war is making, there are three chief courses open to the modern state. The first is to get men by conscription and material by requisition. The British government takes more modestly than any other in the world its tradition from Magna Carta onwards, the legal training of most of its members, all make towards a reverence for private ownership and private claims, as opposed to the claims of state and commonweal, unequalled in the world's history. The next course of a nation in need is to tax and pay for what it wants, which is a fractional and more evenly distributed method of taking. Both of these methods raise prices, the second most so, and so facilitate the automatic release of the future from the boarding of the past. So far, all the belligerent governments have taxed on the timid side. Finally, there is the loan. This mortgages the future to the present necessity, and it has so far been the predominant source of war credits. It is the method that produces least immediate friction in the state. It employs all the savings of surplus income that the unrest of civil enterprise leaves idle. It has an effect of creating property by a process that destroys the substance of the community. In Germany, an enormous bulk of property has been mortgaged to supply the subscriptions to the war loans, and those holdings have again been hypothecated to subscribe to subsequent loans. The pledged allies with longer stockings have not yet got to this pitch of overlapping, but everywhere in Europe what is happening is a great transformation of the property owner into a rentier and the passing of realty into the hands of the state. At the end of the war, Great Britain will probably find herself with a national debt so great that she will be committed to the payment of an annual interest greater in figures than the entire national expenditure before the war. As an optimistic lady put it the other day, all the people who aren't killed will be living quite comfortably on war loan for the rest of their lives. But part, at least, of the bulk of this wealth will be imaginary rather than real, because of the rise in prices, in wages, in rent, and in taxation. Most of us who are buying the British and French war loans have no illusions on that score. We know we are buying an income of diminishing purchasing power, yet it would be a poor creature in these days when there is scarcely a possible young man in one circle who has not quite freely and cheerfully staked his life, who was not prepared to consider his investments as being also, to an undefined extent, a national subscription. A rise in prices is not, however, the only process that will check the appearance of a new rich usurer class after the war. There is something else ahead that has happened already in Germany that is quietly coming about among the Allies, and that is the cessation of gold payments. In Great Britain, of course, the pound note is still convertible into a golden sovereign, but Great Britain will not get through the war on those terms. There comes a point in the stress upon a government when it must depart from the austerer line of financial rectitude and tamper in some way with currency. Sooner or later, and probably in all cases before 1917, all the belligerents will be forced to adopt inconvertible paper money for their internal uses. There will be British assignats or greenbacks. It will seem to many financial sentimentalists almost as though Great Britain were hauling down a flag when the sovereign, which has already disappeared into bank and treasury coffers, is locked up there and resolved for international trade. But Great Britain has other sentiments to consider than the finer feelings of bankers and the delicacies of usury. The British pound will come out of this war like a company out of a well-shelled trench, attenuated. Depreciation of the currency means, of course, a continuing rise in prices, a continuing writing off of debt. If Labour has any real grasp of its true interests, it will not resent this. It will merely insist steadfastly on a proper adjustment of its wages to the new standard. On that point, however, it will be better to write later. Let us see how far we have got in this guessing. We have considered reasons that seem to point to the destruction of a great amount of old property or old debt, and the creation of a great volume of new debt before the end of the war, and we have adopted the ideas that currency will probably have depreciated more and more, and prices risen right up to the very end. There will be by that time a general habit of saving throughout the community, a habit more firmly established perhaps in the propertied than in the wages earning class. People will be growing accustomed to a dear and insecure world. They will adopt a habit of caution, become desirous of saving and security. Directly the phase of enormous war loan ends. The new class of rentiers holding the various great new national loans will find themselves drawing this collectively vast income and anxious to invest it. They will for a time be receiving the bulk of the unearned income of the world. Here, in the high prices representing demand and the need for some reinvestment of interest representing supply, we have two of the chief factors that are supposed to be necessary to a phase of business enterprise. Will the economic history of the next few decades be the story of a restoration of the capitalistic system upon a new basis? Shall we all become investors, speculators, or workers toiling our way to a new period of security, cheapness, and low interest, a restoration of the park, the enclosure, the gold standard, and the big automobile, with only this difference, that the minimum wage will be somewhere about £2 and that a £5 note will purchase about as much as a couple of guineas would do in 1913? That is practically parallel with what happened in the opening half of the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars, and it is not an agreeable outlook for those who love the common man or the nobility of life. But if there is any one principle sounder than another of all those that guide the amateur in prophecy, it is that history never repeats itself. The human material in which those monetary changes and those developments of credit will occur will be entirely different from the social medium of 100 years ago. The nature of the state has altered profoundly in the last century. The later 18th and earlier 19th centuries constituted a period of extreme individualism. What were called economic forces had unrestricted play. In the minds of such people as Harriet Martineau and Herbert Spencer, they superseded God. People were no longer reproached for flying in the face of providence, but for flying in the face of political economy. In that state of freedom, you got whatever you could in any way you could. You were not your neighbour's keeper, and except that it interfered with the enterprise of pickpockets, burglars, and forgers, and kept the dice loaded in favour of landlords and lawyers, the state stood aside from the great drama of human getting. For industrialism and speculation, the state's guiding maxim was laissez-faire. The state is now far less aloof and more constructive. It is far more aware of itself and the common interest. Germany has led away from a system of individuals and voluntary associations of competition towards a new order of things, a completer synthesis. This most modern state is far less a swarming conflict of businesses than a great national business. It will emerge from this war much more so than it went in, and the thing is, and will remain so plain and obvious, that only the greediest and dullest people among the pledged allies will venture to disregard it. The allied nations, too, will have to rescue their economic future from individual grab and grip and chance. The second consideration that forbids us to anticipate any parallelism of the history of 1915 to 45 with 1815 to 45 is the greater lucidity of the general mind, the fact that all Western Europe, down to the agricultural labourers, can read and write and does read newspapers and get ideas. The explanation of economic and social processes that were mysterious to the elect 100 years ago are now the commonplaces of the tap room. What happened then darkly and often unconsciously must happen in 1916 to 26 openly and controllably. The current bankruptcy and liquidation and the coming reconstruction of the economic system of Europe will go on in a quite unprecedented amount of light. We shall see and know what is happening much more clearly than anything of the kind has ever been seen before. It is not only that people will have behind them, as a light upon what is happening, the experiences and discussions of 100 years, but that the international situation will be far plainer than it has ever been. This war has made Germany the central fact in all national affairs about the earth. It is not going to destroy Germany, and it seems improbable that either defeat or victory, or any mixture of these, will immediately alter the cardinal fact of Germany's organized aggressiveness. The war will not end the conflict of anti-Germany and Germany. That will only end when the results of 50 years of aggressive education in Germany have worn away. This will be so plain that the great bulk of people everywhere will not only see their changing economic relationships far more distinctly than such things have been seen hitherto, but that they will see them as they have never been seen before, definitely oriented to the threat of German world predominance. The landlord who squeezes, the workman who strikes and shirks, the lawyer who fogs and obstructs will know, and will know that most people know, that what he does is done, not under an empty, regardless heaven, but in the face of an unsleeping enemy and in disregard of a continuous, urgent necessity for unity. So far, we have followed this speculation upon fairly firm ground, but now our inquiry must plunge into a jungle of far more difficult and uncertain possibilities. Our next stage brings us to the question of how people and peoples and classes of people are going to react to the new conditions of need and knowledge this war will have brought about, and to the new demands that will be made upon them. This is really a question of how far they will prove able to get out of the habits and traditions of their former social state, how far they will be able to take generous views and make sacrifices and unselfish efforts, and how far they will go in self-seeking or class selfishness regardless of the common welfare. This is a question we have to ask separately of each great nation, and of the Central Powers as a whole, and of the Allies as a whole, before we can begin to estimate the posture of the peoples of the world in, say, 1946. Now let me here make a sort of parenthesis on human nature. It will be rather platitudinous, but it is a necessary reminder for what follows. So far as I have been able to observe, nobody lives steadily at one moral level. If we are wise, we shall treat no man and no class, and for the matter of that, no nation, as either steadfastly malignant or steadfastly disinterested. There are phases in my life when I could die quite cheerfully for an idea. There are phases when I would not stir 6 yards to save a human life. Most people fluctuate between such extremes. Most people are self-seeking, but most people will desist from a self-seeking cause if they see plainly and clearly that it is not in the general interest, and much more readily if they also perceive that other people are of the same mind, and know that they know their course is unsound. The fundamental error of orthodox political economy and of Marxian socialism is to assume the inveterate selfishness of everyone. But most people are a little more disposed to believe what it is to their interest to believe than the contrary. Most people abandon with reluctance ways of living and doing that have served them well. Most people can see the neglect of duty in other classes more plainly than they do in their own. This war has brought back into the everyday human life of Europe the great and overriding conception of devotion to a great purpose. But that does not imply clear-headedness in correlating the ways of one's ordinary life with this great purpose. It is no good treating as cynical villainy things that merely exhibit the incapacity of our minds to live inconsistently. One Labour paper a month or so ago was contrasting Mr. Asquith's eloquent appeals to the working man to economise and forego any rise in wages with the photographs that were appearing simultaneously in the smart papers of the very smart marriage of Mr. Asquith's daughter. I submit that by that sort of standard, none of us will be blameless, but without any condemnation, it is easy to understand that the initiative to tax almost to extinction large automobiles, wedding dresses, champagne, pâté de foie gras, and enclosed parks, instead of gin and water, bank holiday outings, and Virginia shag, is less likely to come from the Prime Minister class than from the class of dock labourers. There is an unconscious class war due to habit and insufficient thinking and sufficient sympathy that will play a large part in the distribution of the burthen of the state bankruptcy that is in progress and in the subsequent readjustment of national life. And having made this parenthesis, I may perhaps go on to point out the peculiar limitations under which various classes will be approaching the phase of reorganization without being accused of making this or that class the villain of an anticipatory drama. Now, three great classes will certainly resist the valiant reconstruction of economic life with a vigour in exact proportion to their baseness, stupidity, and narrowness of outlook. They will, as classes, come up for a moral judgment on whose verdicts the whole future of Western civilization depends. If they cannot achieve a considerable and an unprecedented display of self-sacrifice, unselfish wisdom, and constructive vigour, if the community as a whole can produce no forces sufficient to restrain their lower tendencies, then the intelligent father had better turn his children's faces towards the new world, for Europe will be busy with social disorder for a century. The first class is a class that owns and holds land and land-like claims upon the community, from the throne downwards. This court and land-holding class cannot go on being rich and living rich during the strains of the coming years. The Reconstruction world cannot bear it. Whatever rises in rent may occur through the rise in prices must go to meet the tremendous needs of the state. This class, which has so much legislative and administrative power in at least three of the great belligerents in Great Britain and Germany, perhaps most so, must be prepared to see itself taxed and must be willing to assist in its own taxation to the very limit of its statistical increment. The almost vindictive greed of the landowners that blackened the history of England after Waterloo and brought Great Britain within sight of revolution must not be repeated. The British Empire cannot afford a revolution in the face of the Central European powers. But in the past century, there has been an enormous change in man's opinions and consciences about property. Whereas we were individualists, now we are socialists. The British lord, the German junker, has none of the sense of unqualified rights that his great-grandfather had, and he is aware of a vigour of public criticism that did not exist in the former time. How far will these men get out of the tradition of their birth and upbringing? Next comes the great class of lawyers who, through the idiotic method of voting in use of modern democracies, are able practically to rule Great Britain and who are powerful and influential in all democratic countries. In order to secure a certain independence and integrity in its courts, Great Britain long ago established the principle of enormously overpaying its judges and lawyers. The natural result has been to give our law courts and the legal profession generally a bias in favor of private wealth against both the public interest and the proletariat. It has also given our higher national education an overwhelming direction towards the training of advocates and against science and constructive statecraft. An ordinary lawyer has no idea of making anything. That tendency has been destroyed in his mind. He waits and sees and takes advantage of opportunity. Everything that can possibly be done in England is done to make our rulers Micawbers and artful dodgers. One of the most anxious questions that a Briton can ask himself today is just how far the gigantic sufferings and still more monstrous warnings of this war have shocked the good gentlemen who must steer the ship of state through the strong rapids of the new peace out of this forensic levity their training has imposed upon them. There again, there are elements of hope. The lawyer has heard much about himself in the past few years. His conscience may check his tradition. And we have a press. It has many faults, but it is no longer a lawyer's press. And the third class, which has immediate interests antagonistic to bold reconstructions of our national methods, is that vaguer body, the body of investing capitalists, the savers, the usurers, who live on dividends. In a vast class, but a feeble class, in comparison with the other two, it is a body rather than a class, a weight rather than a power. It consists of all sorts of people with nothing in common except the receipt of unearned income. All these classes by instinct, and the baser kinds of reason also, will be doing their best to check the rise in prices, stop and reverse the advance in wages, prevent the debasement of the circulation, and facilitate the return to a gold standard and a repressive social stability. They will be resisting any comprehensive national reconstruction, any increase in public officials, any conscription of land or railways or whatnot for the urgent civil needs of the state. They will have fighting against these tendencies something in their own consciences, something in public opinion, the tradition of public devotion their own dead sons have revived, and certain other forces. They will have over against them the obvious urgent necessities of the time. The most urgent necessity will be to get back the vast moiety of the population that has been engaged either in military service or the making of munitions to productive work, to the production of food and necessary things, and to the restoration of that export trade which, in the case of Great Britain at least, now that her overseas investments have been set off by overseas war debts, is essential to the food supply. There will be coming back into civil life not merely thousands, but millions of men who have been withdrawn from it. They will feel that they have deserved well of their country. They will have had their imaginations greatly quickened by being taken away from the homes and habits to which they were accustomed. They will have been well fed and inured to arms, to danger, and the chances of death. They will have no illusions about the conduct of the war by the governing classes or the worshipful heroism of peers and princes. They will know just how easy is courage, and how hard is hardship, and the utter impossibility of doing well in war or peace under the orders of detected fools. The vast body will constitute a very stimulating congregation of spectators in any attempt on the part of landlord, lawyer, and investor to resume the old political mystery dance, in which rents are to be sent up and wages down, while the old feuds of Wales and Ireland, ancient theological and sectarian jealousies and babyish loyalties, and so forth, are to be waved in the eyes of the no longer fascinated realists. Meanwhile, they will say, with a stiff impatience unusual in their class, about us? Here are the makings of internal conflict in every European country. In Russia, the landlord and lawyer. In France, the landlord are perhaps of less account, and in France, the investor is more universal and jealous. In Germany, where Junker and court are almost influential and brutal, there is a larger and sounder and broader tradition of practical efficiency a modernized legal profession, and a more widely diffused scientific imagination. How far in each country will imagination triumph over tradition and individualism? How far does the practical bankruptcy of Western civilization mean a revolutionary smash up and a phase that may last for centuries of disorder and more futile conflict? And how far does it mean a reconstruction of human society within a few score of years upon sounder and happier lines? Must that reconstruction be preceded by a revolution in all or any of the countries? To what extent can the world produce the imagination it needs? That, so far, is the most fundamental question to which our prophetic explorations have brought us. Chapter 4: Braintree, Bocking, and the Future of the World. Will the war be followed by a period of great distress, social disorder, and a revolution in Europe, or shall we put through the crisis without violent disaster? May we even hope that Great Britain will step straight out of the war into a phase of restored and increased welfare? Like most people, I have been trying to form some sort of answer to this question. My state of mind in the last few months has varied from a considerable optimism to profound depression. I have met and talked to quite a number of young men in khaki, ex-engineers, ex-lawyers, ex-schoolmasters, ex-businessmen of all sorts, and the net result of these interviews has been a buoyant belief that there is, in Great Britain, the pluck, the will, the intelligence to do anything, however arduous and difficult, in the way of national reconstruction. And on the other hand, there is a certain stretch of road between Dunmow and Coggeshall. That stretch of road is continually jarring with my optimistic thoughts. It is a strongly pro-German piece of road. It supports allegations against Great Britain, as, for instance, that the British are quite unfit to control their own affairs, let alone those of an empire, that they are an incompetent people, a pig-headedly stupid people, a wasteful people, a people incapable of realizing that a man who tills his field badly is a traitor and a weakness to his country. Let me place the case of this high road through Braintree, Bocking intervening, before the reader. It is, you will say perhaps, very small beer, but a straw shows the way the wind blows. It is a trivial matter of road metal, mud, and water pipes, but it is also diagnostic of the essential difficulties in the way of the smooth and rapid reconstruction of Great Britain, and very probably of the reconstruction of all Europe after the war. The Braintree High Road, I will confess, becomes at times an image of the world for me. It is a poor, spiritless-looking bit of road with raw stones on one side of it. It is also, I perceive, the high destiny of man in conflict with mankind. It is the way to Harwich, Holland, Russia, China, and the whole wide world. Even at the first glance, it impresses one as not being the road that would satisfy an energetic and capable people. It is narrow for a high road, and in the middle of it, one is checked by an awkward bend, by crossroads that are not exactly crossroads, so that one has to turn two blind corners to get on eastward, and a policeman, I don't know at what annual cost, has to be posted to nurse the traffic across. Beyond that point, one is struck by the fact that the south side is considerably higher than the north, that storm water must run from the south side to the north and lie there. It does, and the north side has recently met the trouble by putting down raw flints, and so converting what would be a lake into a sort of flint pudding. Consequently, one drives one's car as much as possible on the south side of this road. There is a suggestion of hostility and repartee between north and south side in this arrangement, which the explorers' inquiries will confirm. It may be only an accidental parallelism with profounder fact, I do not know. But the middle of this high road is a frontier. The south side belongs to the urban district of Braintree, the north of the rural district of Bocking. If the curious inquirer will take pick and shovel, he will find at any rate one corresponding dualism below the surface. He will find a Bocking water main supplying the houses on the north side and the Braintree water main supplying the south. I rather suspect that the drains are also in duplicate. The total population of Bocking and Braintree is probably little more than 13,000 souls altogether, but for that there are 2 water supplies, 2 sets of schools, 2 administrations. The rurality of the Bocking side is indistinguishable from the urbanity of the Braintree side. It is just a little muddier. But there are dietetic differences. If you will present a Bocking rustic with a tin of the canned fruit that is popular with the Braintree townsfolk, you will discover one of these differences. A dustman perambulates the road on the Braintree side, and canned food becomes possible and convenient therefore. But the Braintree grocers sell canned food with difficulty into Bocking. Bocking, less fortunate than its neighbour, has no dustman apparently, and is left with the tin on its hands. It can either bury it in its garden, if it has a garden, take it out for a walk, wrapped in paper, and drop it quietly in a ditch, if possible in the Braintree area, or build a cairn with it and its predecessors and successors in honour of the local government board. President 5,000, Parliamentary Secretary 1,500, Permanent Secretary 2,000, Legal Advisor 1,000 upwards, a total administrative expenditure of over £300,000. In death, Bocking and Braintree are still divided. They have their separate cemeteries. Now, to any disinterested observer, there lies about the Braintree Bocking railway station one community. It has common industries and common interests. There is no octroi or anything of that sort across the street. The shops and inns on the Bocking side of the main street are indistinguishable from those on the Braintree side. The inhabitants of the 2 communities intermarry freely. If this absurd separation did not exist, no one would have the impudence to establish it now. It is wasteful, unfair, because the Bocking piece is rather better off than Braintree and with fewer people, so that there is a difference in the rates, and for 9/10 of the community, it is more or less of a nuisance. It is also a nuisance to the passing public because of such inconvenience as the asymmetrical main road. It hinders local development and the development of a local spirit. It may, of course, appeal perhaps to the humorous outlook of the followers of Mr. G.K. Chesterton and Mr. Belloc, who believe that this war is really a war in the interests of the Athanasian Creed, fatness and unrestricted drink against science, discipline, and priggishly keeping it fit enough to join the army, as very good fun indeed. Good matter for some jolly reeling ballad about roundabout and roundabout, the jolly town of roundabouts. But to anyone else, the question of how it is that this wasteful Bocking Braintree muddle, with its 2 boards, its 2 clerks, its 2 series of jobs and contracts, manages to keep on, was even before the war a sufficiently discouraging one. It becomes now a quite crucial problem, because the muddle between the sides of the main road through Bocking and Braintree is not an isolated instance. It is a fair sample of the way things are done in Great Britain. It is an imitation of the way in which the great task of industrial resettlement that the nation must face may be attempted. It is, or shall I write it may be? That is just the question I do not settle in my mind. I would like to think that I have hit upon a particularly bad case of entangled local government, but it happens that whenever I have looked into local affairs, I have found the same sort of waste and insobriety of arrangement. When I started a little while back, I go to Braintree to verify these particulars. I was held up by a flood across the road between Little Easton and Dunmow. Every year that road is flooded and impassable for some days, because a bit of the affected stretch is under the county council and a bit under the Little Easton Parish Council, and they cannot agree about the contribution of the latter. These things bump against the most unworldly. And when one goes up the scale from the urban district and rural district boundaries, one finds equally crazy county arrangements. The same tangle of obstacle in the way of quick, effective coordinations, the same needless multiplicity of clerks, the same rich possibilities of litigation, misunderstanding, and deadlocks of opinion between areas whose only difference is that a mischievous boundary has been left in existence between them, and so on up to Westminster, and to still greater things. I know perfectly well how unpleasant all this is to read, this outbreak at two localities that have never done me any personal harm, except a little mud splashing. But this is a thing that has to be said now, because we are approaching a crisis when dilatory ways, muddle and waste may utterly ruin us. This is the way things have been done in England. This is our habit of procedure, and if they are done in this way after the war, this empire is going to smash. Let me add at once that it is quite possible that things are done almost as badly or quite as badly in Russia or France or Germany or America. I am drawing no comparisons. All of us human beings were made, I believe, of very similar clay, and very similar causes have been at work everywhere. Only that excuse, so popular in England, will not prevent a smash if we stick to the old methods under the stresses ahead. I do not see that it is any consolation to share in a general disaster. And I am sure that there must be the most delightful and picturesque reasons why we have all this overlapping and waste and muddle in our local affairs, why, to take another example, the boundary of Essex parishes of Newton and Widdington looks as though it had been sketched out by a drunken man in a runaway cab with a broken spring. This Balkan Braintree main road is, as it happens, an old stained street, along which Roman legions marched to clean up the councils and clerks of the British tribal system 2,000 years ago, and no doubt an historian could spin delightful consequences. This does not alter the fact that these quaint complications in English affairs mean in the aggregate enormous obstruction and waste of human energy. It does not alter the much graver fact, the fact that darkens all my outlook upon the future, that we have never yet produced evidence of any general disposition at any time to straighten out or even suspend these fumbling intricacies and ineptitudes. Never so far has there appeared in British affairs that divine passion to do things in the clearest, cleanest, least wasteful, most thorough manner that is needed to straighten out, for example, these universal local tangles. Always we have been content with the old intricate, expensive way, and to this day we follow it. And what I want to know, what I would like to feel much surer about than I do, is this in our blood? Or is it only the deep-seated habit of long ages of security, long years of margin so ample that no waste seemed altogether wicked? Is it in fact a hopeless and ineradicable trait that we stick to extravagance and confusion? What I would like to think possible at the present time, up and down the scale from parish to providence, is something of this sort. Suppose the clerk of Braintree went to the clerk of Bocking and said, "Look here, one of us could do the work of both of us, or as well, or better. The easy times are over, and officers as well as men should be prepared to die for their country. Shall we toss to see who shall do it, and let the other man go off to find something useful to do?" Then I could believe such acts of virtue happen in the United States. Here is a quotation from the New York World of February 15th, 1916. For two unusual acts, Henry Brewer may be remembered by New York longer than 9 days. Early in his incumbency, he declared that his office was superfluous and should be abolished, the controller assuming its duties. He now abolishes by resignation his own connection with it, in spite of its $12,000 salary. Suppose the people of Braintree and Bocking, not waited for that lead, said, "But this is absurd. Let us have an identical council and one clerk and get ahead, instead of keeping up this silly pretense that one town is two." Suppose someone of that £300,000 worth of gentlemen at the local government board set to work to replan our local government areas, generally on less comic lines. Suppose his official superiors helped, instead of snubbing him. I see nothing of the sort happening. I see everywhere wary, watchful little men, thinking of themselves, thinking of their parish, thinking close, holding tight. I know that there is a whole web of excuses for all these complicated, wasteful, and obstructive arrangements for our local government. These arrangements that I have taken merely as a sample of the general human way of getting affairs done. For it is affairs at large I am writing about, as I warned the reader of at the beginning. Directly one inquires closely into a human muddle, one finds all sorts of reasonable rights and objections and claims barring the way to any sweeping proposals. I can quite imagine that Bockin has admirable reasons for refusing coalescence with Braintree except upon terms that Braintree could not possibly consider. I can quite understand that there are many inconveniences and arguable injustices that would be caused by a merger of the two areas. I have no doubt it would mean serious loss to so-and-so and quite novel and unfair advantage to so-and-so. It would take years to work the thing and get down to the footing of one water supply and an ambidextrous dustman on the lines of perfect justice and satisfactoriness all round. But what I want to maintain is that these little immediate claims and rights and vested interests and bits of justice and fairness are no excuse at all for preventing things being done in the clear, clean, large, quick way. They never constituted a decent excuse, and now they excuse waste and delay and inconvenience less than ever. Let us first do things in the sound way, and then, if we can, let us pet and compensate any disappointed person who used to profit by their being done roundabout, instead of earning an honest living. We are beginning to agree that reasonably any man may be asked to die for his country. What we have to recognize is that any man's proprietorship, interests, claims, or rights may just as properly be called upon to die. Bockin and Braintree and Mr. John Smith, the ordinary comfortable man with a stake in the country, have been thinking altogether too much of the claims and rights and expectations and economies of Bockin and Braintree and Mr. John Smith. They have to think now in a different way. Just consider the work of reconstruction that Great Britain alone will have to face in the next year or so, and her task is, if anything, less than that of her antagonists or allies, except Japan and Italy. She has now probably from 6 to 10 million in the British Isles, men and women, either engaged directly in warfare or in the manufacture of munitions or in employment such as transit, nursing, and so forth, directly subserving these main ends. At least 5/6 of these millions must be got back to employment of a different character within a year of the coming of peace. Everywhere manufacture, trade, and transit has been disorganized, disturbed, or destroyed. A new economic system has to be put together within a brief score or so of weeks. Great dislocated masses of population have to be fed, kept busy, and distributed in a world financially strained and abounding in wounded, cripples, widows, orphans, and helpless people. In the next year or so, the lives of half the population will have to be fundamentally readjusted. Here is work for administrative giants, work for which no powers can be excessive. It will be a task quite difficult enough to do even without the opposition of legal rights, haggling owners, and dexterous profiteers. It would be a giant's task if all the necessary administrative machinery existed now in the most perfect condition. How is this tremendous job going to be done if every bocking in the country is holding out for impossible terms from Braintree, and every Braintree holding out for impossible terms from Bocking, while the road out remains choked and confused between them? And if every John Smith with a claim is insisting upon his reasonable expectation of profits or dividends, his reasonable solatium and compensation for getting out of the way? I would like to record my conviction that if the business of this great crisis is to be done in the same spirit, the jealous, higgling, legal spirit that I have seen prevailing in British life throughout my half-century of existence, it will not in any satisfactory sense of the phrase get done at all. This war has greatly demoralized and discredited the governing class in Great Britain, and if big masses of unemployed and unfed people no longer strung by the actuality of war, masses now trained to arms and with many quite sympathetic officers available, and released clumsily and planlessly into a world of risen prices and rising rents, of legal obstacles and forensic complications, of greedy speculators and hampered enterprises, there will be insurrection and revolution. There will be bloodshed in the streets and the chasing of rulers. There will be, if we do seriously attempt to put the new wine of humanity, the new crude fermentations at once so hopeful and so threatening that the war has released into the old administrative bottles that served our purposes before the war. I believe that for old lawyers and old politicians and private ownership to handle the great problem of reconstruction after the war in the spirit in which our affairs were conducted before the war is about as hopeful an enterprise as if an elderly jobbing bricklayer, working on strict trade union rules, set out to stop the biggest avalanche that ever came down the mountainside. And since I am by no means altogether pessimistic, in spite of my qualmy phrases, it follows that I do not believe that the old spirit will necessarily prevail. I do not, because I believe that in the past few decades, a new spirit has come into human affairs, that our ostensible rulers and leaders have been falling behind the times, and that in the young and the untried, in, for example, the young European of 30 and under who is now in such multitudes thinking over life and his seniors in the trenches, there are still unsuspected resources of will and capacity, new mental possibilities and new mental habits that entirely disturb the argument based on the typical case of Bocking and Braintree for a social catastrophe after the war. How best can this new spirit be defined? It is the creative spirit as distinguished from the legal spirit. It is the spirit of courage to make and not the spirit that waits and sees and claims. It is the spirit that looks to the future and not to the past. It is the spirit that makes Bocking forget that it is not Braintree and John Smith forget that he is John Smith, and both remember that they are England. For everyone, there are two diametrically different ways of thinking about life. There is individualism, the way that comes as naturally as the grunt from a pig, of thinking outwardly from oneself as the center of the universe. And there is the way that every religion is trying in some form to teach, of thinking back to oneself from greater standards and realities. There is the Braintree that is Braintree against England and the world, giving as little as possible and getting the best of the bargain. And there is the Braintree that identifies itself with England and asks how we can do best for the world with this little place of ours, How can we educate best, produce most, and make our roads straight and good for the world to go through? Every American knows the district that sends its congressman to Washington for the good of his district, and the district, the rarer district, that sends a man to work for the United States. There is the John Smith who feels towards England and the world as a mite feels towards its cheese, and the John Smith who feels towards his country as a sheepdog feels towards the flock. The former is the spirit of individualism, business, and our law. The latter, the spirit of socialism and science and khaki, they are both in all of us. They fluctuate from day to day. First one is ascendant, and then the other. War does not so much tilt the balance as accentuate the difference. One rich British landowner sneaks off to New York State to set up a home there and evade taxation. Another turns his mansion into a hospital and goes off to help Serbian refugees. Acts of baseness or generosity are contagious. This man will give himself altogether because of a story of devotion. This man declares he will do nothing until Sir F.E. Smith goes to the front. And the would-be prophet of what is going to happen must guess the relative force of these most impalpable and uncertain things. This Braintree Bocking boundary, which runs down the middle of the road, is to be found all over the world. You will find it in Ireland, and the gentlemen who trade on the jealousies of the north side, and the gentlemen who trade on the jealousies of the south. You will find it in England among the good people who would rather wreck the empire than work honestly and fairly with labour. There are not only parish boundaries, but park boundaries and class and sect boundaries. You will find the Bocking Braintree line too, at a dozen points on a small-scale map of Europe. These Braintree Bocking lines are the barbed wire entanglements between us and the peace of the world. Against these entanglements in every country, the new spirit struggles in many thousands of minds. Where will it be strongest? Which country will get clear first, get most rapidly to work again, have least of the confusion and wrangling that must in some degree occur everywhere? Will any country go altogether to pieces in hopeless, incurable discord? Now, I believe that the answer to that last question is no. And my reason for that answer is the same as my reason for believing that the association of the pledged allies will not break up after the war. It is that I believe that this war is going to end not in the complete smashing up and subjugation of either side, but in a general exhaustion that will make the recrudescence of the war still possible but very terrifying. Mars will sit like a giant above all human affairs for the next 2 decades, and the speech of Mars is blunt and plain. He will say to us all, "Get your houses in order. If you squabble among yourselves, waste time, litigate, muddle, snatch profits, and shirk obligations, I will certainly come down upon you again. I have taken all your men between 18 and 50, and killed and maimed such as I pleased, millions of them. I have wasted your substance contemptuously. Now, mark you, you have multitudes of male children between the ages of 9 and 19 running about among you, delightful and beloved boys. And behind them come millions of delightful babies. Of these I have scarcely smashed and starved a paltry 100,000, perhaps, by the way. But go on muddling, each for himself, and his parish and his family, and none for all the world. Go on in the old way, stick to your rights, stick to your claims, each one of you. Make no concessions and no sacrifices, obstruct, waste, squabble, and presently I will come back again and take all that fresh harvest of life I have spared, all those millions that are now sweet children and dear little boys and youths, and I will squeeze it into the red pulp between my hands. I will mix it with the mud of trenches and feast on it before your eyes, even more damnably than I have done with your grown-up sons and young men, and I have taken most of your superfluities already. Next time, I will take your barest necessities. So the red god, Mars, and in these days of universal education, the great mass of people will understand plainly now that that is his message and intention. Men who cannot be swayed by the love of order and creation may be swayed by the thought of death and destruction. There, I think, is the overriding argument that will burst the proprietorships and divisions and boundaries, the web of ineffectiveness that has held the world so long. Labour returning from the trenches to its country and demanding promptness, planning, generous and devoted leaderships, and organisation, demanding that the usurer and financier, the landlord and law shall, if need be, get themselves altogether out of the way, will have behind its arguments for the thought of the enemy still unsubdued, still formidable, recovering. Both sides will feel that this world is a more illuminated world than 1816. 1,000 questions between law and duty have been discussed since then. Beyond all comparison, we know better what we are doing. I think the broadside of John Smith and Sir John Smith, KC, will get the better of his narrow ends, and that so it will be with Jean Dupont and Hans Meyer and the rest of them. There may be riots here and there may be some pretty considerable rows, but I do not think there is going to be a chaotic and merely destructive phase in Great Britain or any West European country. I cast my guess for reconstruction and not for revolt. Chapter 5. How far will Europe go towards socialism? A number of people are saying that this war is to be the end of individualism. Go as you please has had its death blow. Out of this war, whatever else emerges, there will emerge a more highly organized state than existed before. That is to say, a less individualistic and more socialistic state. And there seems a heavy weight of probability on the side of this view. But there are also a number of less obvious countervailing considerations that may quite possibly modify or reverse this tendency. In this chapter, an attempt is to be made to strike a balance between the two systems of forces and guess how much will be private and how much public in Europe in 1930 or thereabouts. The prophets who foretell the coming of socialism base their case on three sets of arguments. They point out first the failure of individual enterprise to produce a national efficiency comparable to the partial state socialism of Germany, and the extraordinary special dangers inherent in private property that the war has brought to light. Secondly, to the scores of approaches to practical socialism that have been forced upon Great Britain, for example, by the needs of the war. And thirdly, to the obvious necessities that will confront the British Empire and the Allies generally after the war, necessities that no unorganized private effort can hope to meet effectively. All these arguments involve the assumption that the general understanding of the common interest will be sufficient to override individual and class motives, an exceedingly doubtful assumption, to say the least of it. But the general understanding of the common interest is most likely to be kept alive by the sense of a common danger, and we have already arrived at the conclusion that Germany is going to be defeated but not destroyed in this war, and that she will be left with sufficient vitality and sufficient resentment and sufficient of her rancid, cultivated nationalism to make not only the continuance of the alliance after the war obviously advisable and highly probable, but also to preserve in the general mind for a generation or so that sense of a common danger which most effectually conduces to the sweeping aside of merely personal and wasteful claims. Into the consequences of this, we have now to look a little more closely. It was the weaknesses of Germany that made this war, and not her strength. The weaknesses of Germany are her imperialism, her Junkerism, and her intense, sentimental nationalism. For the former would have no German ascendancy that was not achieved by force, and with the latter made the idea of German ascendancy intolerable to all mankind. Better death, we said. And had Germany been no more than her court, her Junkerism, her nationalism, the whole system would have smashed beneath the contempt and indignation of the world within a year. But the strength of Germany has saved her from that destruction. She was at once the most archaic and modern of states. She was Hohenzollern, claiming to be Caesar, and flaunting a flat black eagle borrowed from imperial Rome. And also she was the most scientific and socialist of states. It is her science and her socialism that have held and forced back the Avengers of Belgium for more than a year and a half. If she has failed as a conqueror, she has succeeded as an organization. Her ambition has been thwarted, and her method has been vindicated. She will, I think, be so far defeated in the contest of endurance which is now in progress that she will have to give up every scrap of territorial advantage she has gained. She may lose most of her colonial empire. She may be obliged to complete her modernization by abandoning her militant imperialism, but she will have at least the satisfaction of producing far profounder changes in the chief of her antagonists than those she herself will undergo. The Germany of the Hohenzollerns had its mortal wound at the Marne. The Germany we fight today is the Germany of Krupp and Ostwald. It is merely as if she had put aside a mask that had blinded her. She was methodical and civilized except for her head and aim. She will become entirely methodical. But the Britain and Russia and France she fights are lands full of the spirit of undefined novelty. They are being made over far more completely. They are being made over, not in spite of the war, but because of the war. Only by being made over can they win the war, and if they do not win the war, then they are bound to be made over. They are not merely putting aside old things, but they are forming and organizing within themselves new structures, new and more efficient relationships that will last far beyond the still remote peace settlement. What this war has brought home to the consciousness of every intelligent man outside the German system with such thoroughness as whole generations of discussion and peace experience could never have achieved is a double lesson that Germany had already gone far to master when she blundered into the war. Firstly, the waste and the dangers of individualism, and secondly, the imperative necessity of scientific method in public affairs. The waste and dangers of individualism have had a whole series of striking exemplifications both in Europe and America since the war began. Were there such a thing as a socialist propaganda in existence? Were the so-called socialistic organizations anything better than a shabby little backdoor into contemporary politics? Those demonstrations would be hammering at the mind of everyone. It may be interesting to recapitulate some of the most salient instances. The best illustration, perhaps, of the waste that arises out of individualism is to be found in the extreme dislocation of the privately owned transit services of Great Britain at the present time. There is no essential reason whatever why food and fuel in Great Britain should be considerably dearer than they are under peace conditions. Just the same home areas are under cultivation, just the same foreign resources are available. Indeed, more foreign supplies are available because we have intercepted those that under normal conditions would have gone to Germany. The submarine blockade of Britain is now a negligible factor in this question. Despite these patent conditions, there has been and is a steady increase in the cost of provisions, coal, and every sort of necessity. This increase means an increase in the cost of production of many commodities, and so contributes again to the general scarcity. This is the domestic aspect of a difficulty that has also its military side. It is not sufficient merely to make munitions, they must also be delivered. Great Britain is suffering very seriously from congestion of the railways. She suffers both in social and military efficiency, and she is so suffering because her railways, instead of being planned as one great and simple national distributing system have grown up under conditions of clumsy, dividend-seeking competition. Each great railway company and combination has worked its own areas and made difficulties and aggressions at the boundaries of its sphere of influence. Here are inconvenient junctions, and here unnecessary duplications. Nearly all the companies coming to London, each taking up its own area of expensive land for good yards, sidings, shunting grounds, and each regardless of any proper correlation with the other. Great areas of the country of London are covered with their idle trucks and their separate coal stores. In many provincial towns, you will find 2 or even 3 railway stations at opposite ends of the town. The streets are blocked by the vans and trolleys of the several companies tediously handing about goods that could be dealt with at a tenth of the cost in time and labour at a central clearinghouse. Did such a thing exist, and each system has its vast separate staff, unaccustomed to work with any other staff? Since the war began, the government has taken over the general direction of this disarticulated machinery, but no one with eyes who travels about England now can fail to remark, in the miles and miles of waiting loaded trucks on every siding, the evidences of mischievous and now almost insuperable congestion. The trucks of each system that have travelled on to another still go back, for the most part, empty to their own. And thousands of privately owned trucks, which carry cargo only one way, block our sidings. Great Britain wastes men and time to a disastrous extent in these needless shuntings and handlings. Here, touching every life in the community, is one instance of the muddle that arises naturally out of the individualistic method of letting public services grow up anyhow without a plan or without any direction at all, except the research for private profit. A second series of deficiencies that the war has brought to light in the too individualistic British state is the entire want of connection between private profit and public welfare. So far as the interests of the capitalist go, it does not matter whether he invests his money at home or abroad. It does not matter whether his goods are manufactured in London or Timbuktu. But what of the result? At the outbreak of the war, Great Britain found that a score of necessary industries had drifted out of the country because it did not pay any private person to keep them here. The shortage of dyes has been amply discussed as a typical case. A much graver one that we may now write about was the shortage of zinc. Within a month or so of the outbreak of the war, the British government had to take urgent and energetic steps to secure this essential ingredient of cartridge cases. Individualism had let zinc refining drift to Belgium and Germany. It was the luck rather than the merit of Great Britain that 1 or 2 refineries still existed. Still, more extraordinary things came to light in the matter of the metal supply. Under an individualistic system, you may sell to the highest bidder, and anyone with money from anywhere may come in and buy. Great supplies of colonial ores were found to be cornered by semi-national German syndicates. Supplies were held up by these contracts against the necessities of the empire, and this was but one instance of many which have shown that, while industrial development in the Allied countries is still largely a squabbling confusion of little short-sighted, unscientific, private profit-seeking owners, in Germany it has been for some years increasingly run on far-seeing collectivist lines. Against the comparatively little and mutually jealous British or American capitalists and millionaires, Germany pits itself as a single great capitalist and competitor. She has worked everywhere upon a comprehensive plan. Against her great national electric combination, for example, only another national combination could stand. As it was, Germany, in the way of business, wired and lit and examined, the forts at Liège. She brought and prepared 100 strategic centres in individualistic Belgium and France. So we pass from the fact that individualism is hopeless muddle to the fact that the individualist idea is one of limitless venality, who can buy and may control. And Germany, in her long scheming against her individualist rivals, has not simply set herself to buy and hold the keys and axles of her economic machinery. She has set herself, it must be admitted, with a certain crudity and little success, but with unexampled vigour, to buy the minds of her adversaries. The Western nations have taken a peculiar pride in having a free press, that is to say, a press that may be bought by anyone. Our press is constantly bought and sold in gross and detail by financiers, advertisers, political parties, and the like. Germany came into the market rather noisily, and great papers to a large extent live in glass houses. But her efforts have been sufficient to exercise the minds of great numbers of men with the problem of what might have happened in the way of national confusion if the German attack had been more subtly conceived. It is only a partial answer to this difficulty to say that a country that is so nationalistic and aggressive as Germany is capable of subtle conceptions. The fact remains that in Great Britain at the present time, there are newspaper proprietors who would be good bargains for Germany at £2 million a head, and that there was no effectual guarantee in the individualistic system, but only our good luck and the natural patriotism of the individuals concerned that she did not pick up these bargains before trading with the enemy became illegal. It happened, for example, that Lord Northcliffe was public-spirited. That was the good luck of Great Britain rather than her merit. There was nothing in the individualistic system to prevent Germany from buying up the entire Harmsworth press, the Times, Daily Mail, and all 5 years before the war, and using it to confuse the national mind, destroy the national unity, sacrifice the national interests, and frustrate the national will. Not only the newspapers, but the newsagents and booksellers of both Great Britain and America are entirely at the disposal of any hostile power which chooses to buy them up quietly and systematically. It is merely a question of wealth and cleverness, and if the failure of the Germans to grip the press of the French and English-speaking countries has been conspicuous, she has been by no means so unsuccessful in, for example, Spain. At the present time, the thought and feeling of the Spanish-speaking world is being educated against the Allies. The Spanish mind has been sold by its custodians into German control. Muddle and venality do not, however, exhaust the demonstrated vices of individualism. Individualism encourages desertion and treason. Individualism permits base private people to abscond with the national resources and squeeze a profit out of national suffering. In the early stages of the war, some bright minds conceived the idea of a corner in drugs. It is not illegal. It is quite the sort of thing that appeals to the individualistic frame of mind as entirely meritorious. As the New Statesman put it recently, the happy owners of the world's available stock of a few indispensable drugs did not refrain from making not only the various governments, but also all the sick people of the world pay double and even tenfold prices for what was essential to relieve pain and save life. What fortunes were thus made we shall probably never know, any more than we shall know the tale of the men and women and children who suffered and died because of their inability to pay, not the cost of production of what would have saved them, but the unnecessarily enhanced price that the chances of the market enabled the owners to exact. And another bright instance of the value of individualism is the selling of British shipping to neutral buyers, just when the country is in the most urgent need of every ship it can get, and the deliberate transfer to America of a number of British businesses to evade paying a proper share in the national bill in taxation. The English who have gone to America at different times have been of very different qualities. At the head of the list are the English who went over in the Mayflower, At the bottom will be the rich accessions of this war. And perhaps a still more impressive testimony to the rottenness of these businessmen, upon whom certain eccentric voices call so amazingly to come and govern us, is the incurable distrust they have sown in the minds of labour. Never was an atmosphere of discipline more lamentable than that which has grown up in the factories, workshops, and great privately owned public services of America and Western Europe. The men, it is evident, expected to be robbed and cheated at every turn. I can only explain their state of mind by supposing that they have been robbed and cheated. Their scorn and contempt for their employees' good faith is limitless. Their morale is undermined by an invincible distrust. It is no good for Mr. Lloyd George to attempt to cure the gathered ill of a century with half an hour or so of eloquence. When Great Britain, in her supreme need, turns to the workman she has trained in the ways of individualism for a century, she reaps the harvest individualism has sown. She has to fight with that handicap. Every regulation for the rapid mobilization of labor is scrutinized to find the trick in it. And they find the trick in it as often as not. Smart individualistic business experience has been at the draftsman's elbow. A man in an individualistic system does not escape from class ideas and prejudices by becoming an official. There is profound and bitter wisdom in the deep distrust felt by British labour for both military and industrial conscription. The breakdown of individualism has been so complete in Great Britain that we are confronted with the spectacle of this great and ancient kingdom reconstructing itself perforce, while it wages the greatest war in history. A temporary nationalization of land transit has been improvised, and only the vast, deep-rooted political influence of the ship owners and coal owners have staved off the manifestly necessary step of nationalizing shipping and coal. I doubt if they will be able to stave it off to the end of the long struggle which is still before us if the militarism of Germany is really to be arrested and discredited. Expropriation, and not conscription, will be the supreme test of Britain's loyalty to her allies. The British ship owners in particular are reaping enormous and precarious profits from the war. The blockade of Britain by the British ship owners is scarcely less effective than the blockade of Germany by Britain. With an urgent need of every ship of the national supplies, British ships at the present moment of writing this are still carrying cheap American automobiles to Australia. They would carry munitions to Germany if their owners thought they had a sporting chance of not getting caught at it. These British ship owners are a pampered class with great political and social influence, and no doubt as soon as the accumulating strain of the struggle tells to the extent of any serious restriction of their advantage and prospects, we shall see them shifting to the side of the at present negligible group of British pacifists. I do not think one can count on any limit to their selfishness and treason. I believe that the calculations of some of these extreme and apparently quite unreasonable pacifists are right. Before the war is over, there will be a lot of money in the pacifist business. The rich curs of the West End will join hands with the labour curs of the Clyde. The base are to be found in all classes, but I doubt if they dominate any. I do not believe that any interest or group of interests in Great Britain can stand in the way of the will of the whole people to bring this struggle to a triumphant finish at any cost. I do not believe that the most sacred ties of personal friendship and blood relationship with influential people can save either ship owners or coal owners or army contractors to the end. There will be no end until these profit-makings are arrested. The necessary conscriptions of property must come about in Great Britain because there is no alternative but failure in the war, and the British people will not stand failure. I believe that the end of the war will see not only transit but shipping, collieries, and large portions of the machinery of food and drink production and distribution no longer under the administration of private ownership, but under a sort of provisional public administration, and very many British factories will be in the same case. 2 years ago, no one would have dared to prophesy the tremendous rearrangement of manufacturing machinery which is in progress in Britain today. Thousands of firms of engineers and manufacturers of all sorts, which were flourishing in 1914, exist today only as names, as shapes, as empty shells. Their staffs have been shattered, scattered, reconstructed, their buildings enlarged and modified, their machinery exchanged, reconstituted, or taken. The reality is a vast interdependent national factory that would have seemed incredible to Fourier. It will be as impossible to put back British industrialism into the factories and forms of the pre-war era as it would be to restore the Carthaginian Empire. There is new economic Great Britain today, emergency made, jerry-built no doubt, a gawky, weedy giant, but a giant who may fill out to such dimensions as the German national system has never attained. Behind it is an idea, a new idea, the idea of the nation as one great economic system working together, an idea which could not possibly have got into the sluggish and conservative British intelligence in half a century by any other means than the stark necessities of this war. Great Britain cannot retrace those steps, even if she would, and so she will be forced to carry this process of reconstruction through. And what is happening to Great Britain must, with its national differences, be happening to France and Russia, not only for war ends but for peace ends. Behind the front and sustaining the front, individualities are being hammered together into common and concerted activities. At the end of this war, Great Britain will find herself with this great national factory, this great national organization of labour, planned indeed primarily to make war material, but convertible with the utmost ease to the purposes of automobile manufacture, to transit reconstruction, to electrical engineering, and endless such uses. France and Russia will be in a parallel case. All the world will be exhausted, and none of the Allies will have much money to import automobiles, railway material, electrical gear, and so on from abroad. Moreover, it will be a matter of imperative necessity for them to get ahead of the Central Powers with their productive activities. We shall all be too poor to import from America, and we shall be insane to import from Germany. America will be the continent with the long purse, prepared to buy rather than sell. Each country will have great masses of soldiers waiting to return to industrial life, and will therefore be extremely indisposed to break up any existing productive organization. In the face of these facts, will any of the Allied powers be so foolish as to disband this great system of national factories and nationally worked communications? Moreover, we have already risked the prophecy that this war will not end with such conclusiveness as to justify an immediate beating out of our swords into plowshares. There will be a military as well as a social reason for keeping the national factories in a going state. What more obvious course, then, than to keep them going by turning them on to manufacture goods of urgent public necessity? There are a number of modern commodities now practically standardized: the bicycle, the cheap watch, the ordinary tradesman's delivery automobile, the farmer's runabout, the country doctor's car, much electric lighting material, dynamos, and so forth. And also, in a parallel case, there is shipbuilding. The chemical side of munition work can turn itself with no extreme difficulty to the making of such products as dyes. We face the fact then that either the state must go on with this production as it can do straight off the signing of peace, converting with a minimum of friction, taking on its soldiers as they are discharged from the army as employees, with a maximum waste of time and a minimum of social disorder, and a maximum advantage in the resumption of foreign trade, or there will be a dangerous breakup of the national factory system, a time of extreme chaos and bitter unemployment until capital accumulates for new developments. The risks of social convulsion will be enormous. And there is small hope that the Central Powers, and particularly industrial Germany, will have the politeness to wait through the 10 or 12 years of economic embarrassment that a refusal to take this bold but obviously advantageous step into scientific socialism will entail. But the prophet must be on his guard against supposing that, because a thing is highly desirable, it must necessarily happen, or that because it is highly dangerous, it will be avoided. This bold and successful economic reconstruction upon national lines is not inevitable merely because every sound reason points us to that direction. A man may be very ill. A certain drug may be clearly indicated as the only possible remedy, but it does not follow that the drug is available, that the doctor will have the sense to prescribe it, or the patient the means to procure it, or the intelligence to swallow it. The experience of history is that nations do not take the obviously right course, but the obviously wrong one. The present prophet knows only his England, but so far as England is concerned, he can cover a sheet of paper with scarcely a pause, jotting down memoranda of numberless forces that make against any such rational reconstruction. Most of these forces, in greater or less proportion, must be present in the case of every other country under consideration. The darkest shadow upon the outlook of European civilization at the present time is not the war, it is the failure of any cooperative spirit between labour and the directing classes. The educated and leisured classes have been rotten with individualism for a century. They have destroyed the confidence of the worker in any leadership whatever. Labour stands apart, intractable. If there is to be any such rapid conversion of the economic machinery as the opportunities and necessities of this great time demand, then labour must be taken into the confidence of those who would carry it through. It must be reassured and enlightened. Labour must know clearly what is being done. It must be an assenting cooperator. The stride to economical national service and socialism is a stride that labour should be more eager to take than any other section of the community. The first step in reassuring labour must be to bring the greedy private owner and the speculator under a far more drastic discipline than at present. The property-owning class is continually accusing labour of being ignorant, suspicious, and difficult. It is blind to the fact that it is itself profit-seeking by habit, greedy, conceited, and half-educated. Every step in the mobilization of Great Britain's vast resources for the purposes of the war has been hampered by the tricks, the failures to understand, and the almost instinctive disloyalties of private owners. The raising of rents in Glasgow drove the infuriated workmen of the Clyde district into the unwilling strike. It was an exasperating piece of private selfishness, quite typical of the individualistic state of mind, and the failure to anticipate or arrest it on the part of the government was a worse failure than Suvla Bay. And everywhere the officials of the Ministry of Munitions find private employers holding back workers and machinery from munition works, intriguing, more particularly through the Board of Trade, to have all sorts of manufactures for private profit recognized as munition work, or if that contention is too utterly absurd, then as work vitally necessary to the maintenance of British export trade and the financial position of the country. It is an undeniable fact that employers and men alike have been found far readier to risk their lives for their country than to lay aside any scale of profits to which they have grown accustomed. The conflict of individualistic enterprise and class suspicion against the synthesis of the public welfare is not peculiar to Great Britain. It is probably going on with local variations in Germany, Russia, Italy, France, and indeed in every combatant country. Because of the individualistic forces and feelings, none of us, either friends or enemies, are really getting anything like our full possible result out of our national efforts. But in Germany, there is a greater tradition of subordination. In France, there is a greater clarity of mind than in any other country. Great Britain and Russia in this, as in so many other matters, are at once close kindred and sharp antithesis. Each is mentally crippled by the corruption of its educational system, by an official religious orthodoxy, and hampered by a court which disowns any function of intellectual stimulus. Neither possesses a scientifically educated class to which it can look for the powerful handling of this great occasion, and each has acquired under these disadvantages the same strange faculty for producing sane resultants out of illogical confusions. It is the way of these unmethodical powers to produce unexpected, vaguely formulated and yet effective cerebral action, apparently from their backbones. As I sit playing at prophecy and turn over the multitudinous impressions of the last year in my mind, weighing the great necessities of the time against obstacles and petty-mindedness, I become more and more conscious of a third factor that is neither need nor obstruction, and that is the will to get things right that has been liberated by the war. The new spirit is still but poorly expressed, but it will find expression. The war goes on, and we discuss this question of economic reconstruction as though it was an issue that lay between the labour that has stayed behind and the businessmen. For the most part, old men with old habits of mind who have stayed behind. The real life of Europe's future lies on neither side of that opposition. The real life is mutely busy at present, saying little because of the uproar of the guns, and not so much learning as casting habits and shedding delusions. In the trenches, there are workers who have broken with the old slacking and sabotage, and there are prospective leaders who have forgotten profit. The men between 18 and 40 are far too busy in the blood and mud to make such showing now, but tomorrow, these men will be the nation. When that third factor of the problem is brought in, the outlook of the horoscope improves. The spirit of the war may be counted upon to balance and prevail against the spirit of individualism, this spirit of suspicion and disloyalty, which I fear more than anything else in the world. I believe in the young France, young England, and young Russia this war is making, and so I believe that every European country will struggle along the path that this war has opened to a far more completely organized state than has existed ever before. The Allies will become state firms, as Germany was indeed already becoming before the war, setting private profit aside in the common interest, handling agriculture, transport, shipping, coal, the supply of metals, the manufacture of 1,000 staple articles as national concerns. In the face of the manifest determination of the Central Powers to do as much, the Allies will be forced to link their various state firms together into a great Allied trust, trading with a common interest and a common plan with Germany and America and the rest of the world. Youth and necessity will carry this against selfishness, against the unimaginative, against the unteachable, the suspicious, the old fool. But I do not venture to prophesy that this will come about as if it were a slick and easy deduction from present circumstances. Even in France, I do not think things will move as lucidly and generously as that. There will be a conflict everywhere between wisdom and cunning, between the eyes of youth and the purblind, between energy and obstinacy. The reorganization of the European states will come about clumsily and ungraciously. At every point, the sticker will be found sticking tight, holding out to be bought off, holding out for a rent or a dividend or a share, holding out by mere instinct. At every turn, too, the baller will be loud and active, bawling suspicions, bawling accusations, bawling panic, or just simply bawling. Tricks, peculation, obstinacies, vanities. After this war, men will still be men. But I do believe that through all the dust and din, The great reasons in the case, the steady constructive forces of the situation, will carry us. I believe that out of the ruins of the 19th century system of private capitalism that this war has smashed forever, there will arise, there does even now arise, in this strange scaffolding of national munition factories and hastily nationalized public services, the framework of a new economic and social order based upon national ownership and service. Let us now recapitulate a little and see how far we have got in constructing a picture of the European community as it will be in 15 or 20 years' time. Nominally, it will be little more of a socialist state than it is today, but as a matter of fact, the ships, the railways, the coal and metal supply, the great metal industries, much engineering, and most agriculture will be more or less completely under collective ownership, and certainly very completely under collective control. This does not mean that there will have been any disappearance of private property, but only that there will have been a very considerable change in its character. The owner will be less of controller but more of a creditor. He will be a rentier or an annuitant. The burden of this class upon the community will not be relatively quite so heavy as it would otherwise have been, because of a very considerable rise in wages and prices. In a community in which all the great initiatives have been assumed by the state, the importance of financiers and promoters will have diminished relatively to the importance of administrative officials. The opportunities of private exploitation, indeed, will have so diminished that there will probably be far less evidence of great concentrations of private wealth in the European social landscape than there was before the war. On the other hand, there will be an enormously increased rentier class drawing at the interest of the war loans from the community and maintaining a generally high standard of comfort. There will have been a great demand for administrative and technical abilities and a great stimulation of scientific and technical education. By 1926, we shall be going about a world that will have recovered very largely from the impoverishment of the struggle. We shall tour in state-manufactured automobiles upon excellent roads, and we shall live in houses equipped with a national factory, electric light installation, and at every turn we shall be using and consuming the products of nationalized industry and paying off the national debt simultaneously and reducing our burden of rentiers. At the same time, our boys will be studying science in their schools more thoroughly than they do now, and they will in many cases be learning Russian instead of Greek or German. More of our boys will be going into the public service and fewer thinking of private business, and they will be going into the public service not as clerks, but as engineers, technical chemists, manufacturers, state agriculturalists, and the like. The public service will be less a service of clerks and more a service of practical men. The ties that bind France and Great Britain at the present moment will have been drawn very much closer. France, Belgium, and England will be drifting towards a French-English bilingualism. So much of our picture we may splash in now. Much that is quite essential remains to be discussed. So far, we have said scarcely a word about the prospects of party politics and the problems of government that arise as the state ceases to be a mere impartial adjudicator between private individuals and takes upon itself more and more of the direction of the general life of the community. Chapter 6: Lawyer and Press. The riddle of administration is the most subtle of all those that the would-be prophet of the things that are coming must attempt. We see the great modern states confronted now by vast and urgent necessities, by opportunities that may never recur. Individualism has achieved its inevitable failure. Go as you please in a world that also contained aggressive militarism has broken down. We live in a world of improvised state factories, commandeered railways, substituted labor and emergency arrangements. Our vague-minded, lax, modern democracy has to pull itself together, has to take over and administer and succeed with a great system of collective functions, has to express its collective will in some better terms than go as you please or fail. And we find the affairs of nearly every great democratic state in the hands of a class of men not specially adapted to any such constructive or administrative work. I am writing here now chiefly to the Western Allies. Russia is peculiar in having her administrative machine much more highly developed in relation to her general national life than the free democratic countries. She has to make a bureaucracy that has not hitherto been an example for efficiency into a bureaucracy that will be constructive, responsive, liberal, scientific, and efficient. The Western countries have to do the same with that oligarchy of politicians which, as Professor Michels has recently pointed out in his striking book on political parties, is the necessary reality of democratic government. By different methods, the Eastern and Western powers have to attain a common end. Both bureaucracy and pseudo-democratic oligarchy have to accomplish an identical task to cement the Pacific alliance of the pledged allies and to socialize their common industrial and economic life so as to make it invulnerable to foreign attack. Now, in Great Britain, which is the democracy that has been most under the close observation of the present prophet, there is at present a great outcry against the politician, and more particularly against the lawyer politician. He is our embarrassment. In him we personify all our difficulties. Let us consider the charges against the individual. Let us ask, can we do without him? And let us further see what chances there may be of so altering, qualifying, or balancing him as to minimize the evil of his influence. To begin with, let us run over the essentials of the charge against him. It is with a modest blush that the present prophet recapitulates these charges. So early as the year 1902, he was lifting up his voice, not exactly in the wilderness, but at least in the royal institution, against the legal as compared with the creative or futurist type of mind. The legal mind, he insisted, looks necessarily to the past. It is dilatory because it has no sense of coming things. It is uninventive and wasteful. It does not create, it takes advantage. It is the type of mind least able, under any circumstances, to organize great business, to plan campaigns, to adventure or achieve. Wait and see crystallizes its spirit. Its resistance is admirable, and it has no go. Nevertheless, there is a tendency for power to gravitate in all democratic countries to the lawyer. In the British system, the normal faults of the lawyer are enhanced, and his predominance intensified by certain peculiarities of our system. In the first place, he belongs to a guild of exceptional power. In Britain, it happens that the unfortunate course was taken ages ago of bribing the whole legal profession to be honest. The British judges and the law officers are stupendously overpaid in order to make them incorruptible. It is a poor but perhaps a well-merited compliment to their professional code. We have squared the whole profession to be individually unbribable. The judges, moreover, in the Anglo-Saxon communities are appointed from among the leading barristers, an arrangement that a child can see is demoralizing and inadvisable. And in Great Britain, all the greatest salaries in the government service are reserved for the legal profession. The greatest prizes, therefore, before an energetic young man who has to make his way in Great Britain are the legal prizes, and his line of advancement to these lies, for all the best years of his life, not through the public service, but through the private practice of advocacy. The higher education, such as it is in Great Britain, produces under the stimulus of these conditions an advocate as its finest flower. To go from the posing and chatter of the Union debating society to a university laboratory is, in Britain, to renounce ambition. Few men of exceptional energy will do that. the national consequences of this state of affairs have been only too manifest throughout the conduct of the war. The British government has developed all the strength and all the weakness of the great profession it represents. It has been uninventive, dilatory, and without initiative. It has been wasteful and evasive, but it has not been wanting in a certain eloquence and dignity. It has been wary and shrewd, and it has held on to office with the concentrated skill and determination of a suckerfish. And the British mind, with a concentration and intensity unprecedented before the war, is speculating how it can contrive to get a different sort of ruler and administrator at work upon its affairs. There is a disposition in the press, and much of the private talk one hears, to get rid of lawyers from the control of national affairs altogether, to substitute businessmen or scientific men or experts. That way lies dictatorship and Caesarism. And even Great Britain is not so heedless of the experience of other nations as to attempt again what has already been so abundantly worked out in the national disaster across the Channel. The essential business of government is to deal between man and man. It is not to manage the national affairs in detail, but to secure the proper managers, investigators, administrators, generals, and so forth, to maintain their efficiency, to keep the balance between them. We cannot do without a special class of men for these interventions and controls. In other words, we cannot do without a special class of politicians. They may be elected by a public or appointed by an autocrat. At some point, they have to come in. And this business of intervening between men and classes and departments in public life and getting them to work together is so closely akin to the proper work of a lawyer in dealing between men and men, that unless the latter are absolutely barred from becoming the former, it is almost unavoidable that politicians should be drawn more abundantly from the lawyer class than from any other class in the community. This is so much the case that when the London Times turn in despair from a government of lawyers and looks about for an alternative, the first figure that presents itself is that distinguished advocate, Sir Edward Carson. But there is a difference between recognizing that some sort of lawyer politician is unavoidable and agreeing that the existing type of lawyer, who is so largely accountable for the massive slowness, the confused action, the slovenliness, rather than the weakness of purpose shown by Great Britain in this war, is the only possible type. The British system of education and legal organization is not the last word of human wisdom in these matters. The real case we British have against our lawyers, if I may adopt an expressive colloquialism, is not that they are lawyers, but that they are such infernal lawyers. They trail into modern life most of the faults of the medieval guild. They seem to have no sense of the state they could develop, no sense of the future they might control. Their law and procedure have never been remodeled upon the framework of modern ideas. Their minds are still set to the tune of medieval bickerings, traditionalism, and state blindness. They are mystery dealers. Almost unanimously they have resisted giving the common man the protection of a code. In the United Kingdom we have had no Napoleon to override the profession. It is extraordinary how complete has been their preservation of barbaric conceptions. Even the doctor is now largely emaciated from his archaic limitations as a skilled retainer. He thinks more and more of his public health, and less of his patron. The more recent a profession, the less there is of the individualistic, personal reference. Scientific research, for example, disavows and forbids every personal reference. But while everyone would be shocked at some great doctor or some great research institution in these days of urgent necessity spending 2 or 3 weeks on the minor ailments of some rich person's lapdog, nobody is scandalized at the spectacle of Sir Edward Carson and a costly law court spending long days upon the sordid disputes that centre upon young Master Slingsby's ear, whether it is the Slingsby family ear or the ear of a supposititious child, a question that any 3 old women might be trusted to settle. After that, he rests for a fortnight and recuperates and returns to take up a wheel case, turning upon the toy rabbits and such like trifles which entertained the declining years of a nonagenarian. This when we are assured that the country awaits Sir Edward as its deliverer. It is as if Lord Kitchener took a month off to act at specially high rates for the movies. Our standard for the lawyer is older and lower than it is for other men. There is no more reason nowadays why a lawyer should look to advocacy as a proper use of his knowledge than that a doctor should make private poisoning the lucrative side of his profession. There is no reason why a court of law should ignore the plain right of the common will to intervene in every case between man and man. There is every reason why trivial disputes about wills and legitimacy should not be wasting our national resources at the present time, when nearly every other form of waste is being restrained. The sound case against the legal profession in Anglo-Saxon countries is not that it is unnecessary, but that it is almost incredibly antiquated, almost incredibly careless of the public well-being, and that it corrupts or dwarfs all the men who enter it. Our urgent need is not so much to get rid of the lawyer from our affairs as to get rid of the wig and gown spirit, and of the special pleader, and to find and develop the new lawyer, the lawyer who is not an advocate, who is not afraid of a code, who has had some scientific education, and whose imagination has been quickened by the realization of life as creative opportunity. We want to emancipate this profession from its ancient guild restrictions, the most antisocial and disastrous of all such restrictions, to destroy its disgraceful tradition of overpayment and fee-snatching, to insist upon a scientific, philosophical training for its practitioners, to make the practice of advocacy a fall from grace, and to bar professional advocates from the bench. In the British trenches now, there must be many hundreds of fine young lawyers, still but little corrupted, who would be only too glad to exchange the sordid vulgarities and essential dishonour of a successful lawyer's career under the old conditions for lives of service and statecraft. No observer of the general trend of events in Europe will get any real grasp of what is happening until he realizes the cardinal importance of the reactions that center upon this question. The current development of political institutions and the possible development of a new spirit and method in the legal profession are so intimately interwoven as to be practically one and the same question. The international question is, how can we get a new Germany? The national question everywhere is, can we get a better politician? The widely prevalent discontent with the part played by the lawyer in the affairs of all the Western allies is certain to develop into a vigorous agitation for legal reconstruction. In the case of every other great trade union, the war has exacted profound and vital concessions. The British working men, for example, have abandoned scores of protective restrictions upon women's labour, upon unskilled labour, for which they have fought for generations. They have submitted to a virtual serfdom that the nation's needs might be supplied. The medical profession has sent almost too large a proportion of its members to the front. The scientific men, the writers, have been begging to be used in any capacity at any price or none. The Ministry of Munitions is full of unpaid workers, and so on. The British legal profession and trade union alone has made no sign of any disposition to relax its elaborate restrictions upon the labour of amateurs and women, or to abate one jot or one title of its habitual rewards. There has been no attempt to reduce the costly law officers of the government, for example, or to call in the help of older men or women to release law officers who are of military experience or age. And I must admit that there are small signs of the advent of the new lawyer at whose possibility I have just flung a hopeful glance to replace the existing mass of medieval unsoundness. Barristers seem to age prematurely, at least in Great Britain. unless they are born old. In the legal profession, one hears nothing of the young. One hears only of smart juniors. Reform and progressive criticism in the legal profession, unlike all other professions, seem to be the monopoly of the retired. Nevertheless, Great Britain is as yet only beginning to feel the real stresses of the war. She is coming into the full strain a year behind France, Germany, and Russia. And after the war, there lies the possibility of still more violent stresses, so that what is as yet a mere cloud of criticism and resentment at our lawyer politicians and privileged legal profession may gather to a great storm before 1918 or 1919. I am inclined to foretell as one most highly probable development of the present vague but very considerable revolt against the lawyer in British public life. First, some clumsy proposals or even attempts to leave him out and use businessmen, soldiers, admirals, dictators, or men of science in his place, which is rather like throwing away a grotesque fountain pen and trying to write with a walking stick, or a revolver or a flashlight, and then, when that is found to be impossible, a resolute attempt to clean and reconstitute the legal profession on modern and more honourable lines, a movement into which, quite possibly, a number of the younger British lawyers, so soon as they realise that the movement is good enough to risk careers upon, may throw themselves. A large share in such a reform movement, if it occurs, will be brought about by the press, by which I mean not simply the periodical press, but all books and contemporary discussion. It is only by the natural playing off of press against lawyer politician that democratic states can ever come to their own. And that brings me to the second part of this question, which is whether, quite apart from the possible reform and spiritual rebirth of the legal profession, there is not also the possibility of balancing and correcting its influence. In ancient Hebrew history, it may be a warning rather than a precedent. There were two great forces, one formal, conservative, and corrupting, the other undisciplined, creative, and destructive. The first was the priest, the second the prophet. Their interaction is being extraordinarily paralleled in the Anglo-Saxon democracies by the interaction of lawyer-politician and press today. If the lawyer-politician is unavoidable, the press is indispensable. It is not in the clash and maneuvers and mutual corrections of party, but in the essential conflict of political authority on the one hand and press on the other, that the future of democratic government apparently lies. In the clearer, simpler case of France, a less wealthy and finer type of lawyer interacts with a less impersonal press. It is in the great contrasts and the essential parallelisms of the French and the Anglo-Saxon democratic systems that one finds the best practical reason for anticipating very profound changes in these two inevitables of democracy, the press and the lawyer-politician, and for assuming that the method of democracy has still a vast range of experimental adjustment between them is still untried. Such experimental adjustment will be the chief necessity and business of political life in every country of the world for the next few decades. The lawyer-politician and the press are, as it were, the right and left hands of a modern democracy. The war has brought this out clearly. It has ruptured the long weakened bonds that once linked this and that newspaper with this and that party. For years, the press of all the Western democracies has been drifting slowly away from the tradition. It lasted longest and was developed most completely in Great Britain, that newspapers were party organs. In the novels of Disraeli, the press appears as an ambiguously helpful person who is asked out to dinner, who is even admitted to weekend conferences by the political great. He takes his orders from the Whig peers or the Tory peers. At his greatest, he advises them respectfully, but that was in the closing days of the British oligarchy. That was before modern democracy had begun to produce its characteristic political reforms. It is not so very much more than a century ago that Great Britain had her first lawyer prime minister. Through all the Napoleonic wars, she was still a country ruled by great feudal landlords and gentlemen adventurers associated with them. The lawyers only came to their own at the close of the great Victorian duet of Disraeli and Gladstone, the last of the political gentlemen adventurers. It is only now, in the jolts and dissatisfactions of this war, that Great Britain rubs her eyes and looks at her government as it is. The old oligarchy established a tradition of her diplomacy. Illiberal at home, it was illiberal abroad. Great Britain was the defender of nationality, of constitutionalism, and of the balance of power against the Holy Alliance, in the figure of such a gentleman as Sir Edward Grey. The old order mingles with the new. But most of his colleagues are now of the new order. They would have been incredible in the days of Lord Melbourne. In its essential quality, the present British government is far more closely akin to the French than it is to its predecessor of 100 years ago. Essentially, it is a government of lawyer politicians with no close family ties or intimate political traditions and prejudices, and its natural and proper corrective is the press, over which it fails to exercise now even a shadow of the political and social influence that once kept that power in subjection. It is the way with all human institutions. They remain in appearance long after they have passed away in reality. It is on record that the Roman senates still thought Rome was a republic in the 3rd century of the Christian era. It is nothing wonderful, therefore, that people suppose that the king, the lords, and the commons, debating through a ministry and an opposition, still govern the British Empire. As a matter of fact, it is the lawyer politicians, split by factions, that stimulate the ancient government and opposition, who rule under a steadily growing pressure and checking by the press. Since this war began, the press has released itself, almost inadvertently, from its last association with the dying conflicts of party politics, and has taken its place as a distinct power in the realm, claiming to be more representative of the people than their elective representatives, and more expressive of the national mind and will. Now, there is considerable validity in this claim. It is easy to say that a paper may be bought by any proprietor and set to put what he chooses into the public mind. As a matter of fact, buying a newspaper is far more costly and public a proceeding than buying a politician. And if, on the one hand, the public has no control over what is printed in the paper, it has, on the other, the very completest control over what is read. A politician is checked by votes cast